Hello guys, welcome to The Fiction Wizard. Today we have an incredible story for you. Veela Queen's blood sense detected Harry at age 8 and demanded Gringotts test that revealed 27 stolen Veela Lordship seats. If you enjoy the video, please like and subscribe. Let's get into it. Chapter 1, Blood Calls to Blood. The Dursleys had not brought Harry to Diagon Alley as a treat. He understood that clearly from the moment Uncle Vernon had shoved him into the back seat of the car that morning, muttering about how it was either bring the boy or leave him home alone where he'd probably burn the house down. Aunt Petunia had pursed her lips in that particular way she had, the one that meant she agreed but wasn't going to say so, and Dudley had spent the entire drive pressing his elbow into Harry's ribs with the slow, deliberate patience of someone who had discovered that sustained discomfort was more satisfying than a single hard jab. Harry had watched the motorway blur past and said nothing. He was good at saying nothing. He'd had 8 years of practice. Diagon Alley in late July was loud in the way that only places stuffed with magic could be, a kind of layered, breathing noise that had texture to it, sounds stacked on sounds, owls and cauldrons and someone 3 stalls down demonstrating a self-stirring spoon to a crowd of skeptical witches. Harry had been here twice before, both times trailing at the edge of the Dursleys' orbit like a moon nobody had officially named. He knew the rules: stay close enough not to be lost, stay far enough not to be noticed, don't touch anything, don't look at anything too long, definitely don't speak. Today, Vernon wanted a replacement for a pocket watch that had been accidentally enchanted at his office and now counted backwards in what appeared to be Mermish. He'd been furious about it for 2 weeks. He was still furious about it now, red-faced and sweating in the July heat, leading his family through the cobbled alley with the grim determination of a man completing an unpleasant but necessary mission. Harry kept his hands in the pockets of Dudley's old jeans, 3 sizes too large, cinched with a piece of rope, and watched the world go by with the particular quality of attention he'd developed at the Dursleys, the kind that noticed everything without appearing to notice anything at all. He almost walked into Petunia when she stopped without warning. The whole alley had stopped, actually. Not all at once, it was more like a wave of stillness rolling from the far end of the street toward him, stall owners pausing mid-transaction, shoppers halting, conversations dying. Even Dudley stopped complaining about the heat. Harry stepped to the side to see past Vernon's bulk, stood on his toes, and looked. They were coming from the direction of the leaky cauldron, and the first thing Harry noticed was the light. Not sunlight, the day was bright enough already. This was something different, something that moved with them, a kind of luminescence that didn't cast shadows so much as it dissolved them, a warm gold white that made everything it touched look more real somehow, more sharply itself. There were 12 of them walking in a loose formation, and every single one was a woman, and every single one was the most beautiful person Harry had ever seen, which would have been a more remarkable observation if he hadn't immediately noticed that beauty wasn't quite the right word for what they were. Beautiful was what people called roses and sunsets and his teacher's new haircut. What these women were was something else entirely. Something that made the word beautiful seem like it was trying too hard. They wore robes the color of cream and old gold, and their hair caught the light like it had been specifically designed to do so. The crowd parted for them without being asked, the way water parts for something with weight behind it. At the center of the formation walked a woman who was unmistakably the reason all of this was happening. She was older than the others, Harry could tell that much, though he couldn't have said how, because she looked perhaps 35 by any ordinary measure, and she walked with the unhurried certainty of someone who had never once in her life needed to raise her voice to make a room pay attention. Her hair was silver white and fell in a single heavy wave over one shoulder. Her eyes, even at this distance, were an unsettling shade of pale gold, almost amber, the color of old honey held up to the light. She was talking to one of her companions in a low voice, not looking at the crowd, seemingly unbothered by the entire alley having come to a standstill. And then, without any visible reason, she stopped. Her companion said something. She didn't respond. She was still, the way animals go still when they hear something, not frozen, just intensely focused, every part of her attention suddenly redirected towards something invisible and private. Harry watched her head turn, slow and deliberate, scanning the crowd. He watched her eyes move, passing over faces, moving on, and then they stopped. On him. Harry didn't look away. He'd learned early that looking away from things often made them worse. He met her gaze across 30 feet of crowded alley and felt something he had absolutely no framework for. A vibration was the closest word he had, low and resonant, like a bell struck somewhere in the center of his chest. Not unpleasant. Not entirely comfortable either. Just enormously, inescapably present. The woman took a step toward him. Then another. The formation around her adjusted without hesitation, her companions moving with her like a tide. People in her path stepped aside without being asked, and whether that was magic or just the simple authority of her bearing, Harry couldn't tell. He became aware that the Dursleys were also watching and that Vernon's neck had gone the particular shade of purple that meant he was choosing between outrage and uncertainty. The uncertainty was winning, barely, because something about the woman's approach made outrage seem like a very bad idea. She stopped 3 feet from Harry and crouched down to his eye level, and Harry had the bizarre thought that he could not imagine her doing anything that didn't look entirely deliberate and entirely right, including this. Up close, the amber eyes were extraordinary. There was a quality to them that reminded Harry of the very deep end of the lake near the Dursleys' neighborhood, the way you could tell there was more going on beneath the surface than you could see from up top. "Hello," she said. Her accent was French, her voice low and even and warm. "What is your name, child?" "Harry," he said, because there was no reason not to. "Harry Potter." Something crossed her face. Not surprise exactly, more like the expression of someone whose suspicion has been confirmed in a way that's larger than they were expecting. "I am Seraphine Delacour," she said. She didn't say it like an introduction. She said it like she was giving him something, deliberately. "I am the Queen of the Veela courts of Western Europe. And you, Harry Potter, have been carrying something that belongs to my people for a very long time." Harry processed this. "I didn't steal anything," he said, which was the honest truth and also his first defensive instinct. The ghost of something, it might have been a smile, moved across her face. "No. You did not. The theft was committed against you, not by you." She tilted her head slightly, studying him. "You are not afraid of me." "Should I be?" "Most people are." "Most people are afraid of lots of things," Harry said. He'd observed this extensively. The Dursleys were afraid of magic, afraid of the neighbors knowing about magic, afraid of owls and reports from school and anything they couldn't explain. Fear seemed to take up an enormous amount of their time. Harry had privately concluded some time ago that this was an inefficient way to live. What does "something that belongs to your people" mean? "It means," Seraphine said, "that somewhere in your bloodline, very old promises were made between your family and mine. Promises that carry power. And that power has been redirected by people who had no right to touch it." She paused, and something sharpened in her golden eyes. "How much do you know about your family?" "Almost nothing," Harry said, and was surprised to hear how flat it came out. Not sad, exactly. Just factual. He'd been given almost nothing and he'd learned to take accurate inventory of almost nothing and work with it. Seraphine looked at him for a long moment. Then she straightened, and the quality of the air around her shifted, and Harry understood without anyone telling him that the Queen of the Veela courts had made a decision. "Excuse me." This was directed, clearly and without warmth, at someone behind Harry. He turned to find a woman in emerald robes with a tartan pattern at the collar, silver hair pulled back severely, watching the entire exchange with an expression of barely contained alarm. She had a bag from an apothecary in one hand and the look of someone who had come for a quiet Tuesday errand and was about to have a very different kind of day. "I don't believe the woman began. "You are Minerva McGonagall," Seraphine said. "Deputy headmistress of Hogwarts School. You have been, I understand, periodically checking on this child on behalf of Albus Dumbledore." It was not phrased as a question. McGonagall's expression cycled through several things rapidly. I am his, I check on his welfare as part of, you will send word to Dumbledore immediately, Seraphine said, and the warmth that had been in her voice when she spoke to Harry was entirely absent now. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Tell him that the Veela Queen has invoked blood sense rights under the Accords of Avalon, year 1203, and that I am taking this child to Gringotts for an immediate heritage verification. Under Veela sovereignty law, this cannot be refused, delayed, or challenged without triggering a full audit of all magical contracts registered in Britain since 1970. If Dumbledore wishes to contest it, he may meet us at the bank. McGonagall stared. The Accords of Avalon are still binding. I'd suggest you look them up before the meeting. Seraphine's tone was not unkind, exactly, but it left zero room for anything. She turned back to Harry. Will you come with me? Harry considered this. He looked at the Dursleys, Vernon purpling again, Petunia with her hand on Dudley's arm, both of them processing the fact that someone was asking Harry something and that the asking had the weight of inevitability behind it. He looked at McGonagall, who was already pulling a quill from her bag with hands that weren't entirely steady. He looked back at Seraphine, at the amber eyes that were patient and direct and somehow, impossibly, reminded him of the very early mornings before the Dursleys woke up, when the house was quiet and the world felt like it might be negotiable. Yeah, Harry said. All right. Vernon found his voice. Now, see here, he started, loud, red, his usual opening, that boy is your ward, Seraphine said, without turning around. Not your property. There is a distinction, Mr. Dursley, and I suggest you spend some time considering it. She began walking toward Gringotts, and her court moved with her, and Harry, after one more glance at the Dursleys, fell into step beside her because it seemed like the only thing that made sense. One of the Veela, younger, perhaps 11 or 12, with silver blonde hair and blue eyes that currently held the expression of someone who had been dragged along on what they expected to be a boring errand and was now recalculating, fell into step on Harry's other side. I am Fleur, she said. Her accent was thicker than Seraphine's, her tone carrying the particular quality of someone who defaults to bluntness because they've never seen the point of anything else. She is my grandmother. The Queen is your grandmother? Is that strange? Harry thought about it. No stranger than anything else today. Fleur looked at him with the focused, unsentimental assessment of someone who formed opinions quickly and stood by them. You are not what I expected. What did you expect? Someone who looked more significant. She said it clinically, not cruelly. You are very small. I know, Harry said. People say that. Does it bother you? Not really. Fleur seemed to file this away. I am going to stay for the testing, she announced, in a tone that made clear this was not a request directed at anyone in particular. Grandmere will not send me away. I find this interesting. Good for you, Harry said, and Fleur blinked, and then, briefly, like sunlight through clouds, she almost smiled. Gringotts stood at the end of Diagon Alley the way it always did, marble and imposing, the warning carved above the entrance catching the light. Harry had been inside once, at age 6, when Vernon had business that for mysterious reasons had required him to step inside a magical bank and had required Harry to come with him because Petunia hadn't been there to leave him with. Harry remembered the goblin tellers and the cold air and the sense of ancient, impersonal precision that the place radiated like a second architecture. He'd liked it, in a strange way. It was honest about what it was. The guards at the entrance, 2 goblins in scarlet and gold, each carrying a halberd that looked entirely functional, took one look at Seraphine's procession and stepped aside with precisely the kind of respect that suggested Veela Queens visiting Gringotts was not unprecedented, was expected, and was taken seriously. Inside, the bank was its usual controlled chaos of tellers and customers and the distant, resonant boom of something deep underground that might have been a cart or might have been something else entirely. Several ongoing transactions paused as the Veela court entered. The head teller, a goblin with a face like a weathered cliff and eyes like polished obsidian, looked up from his raised station, assessed the situation in approximately 1 second, and descended the steps with the unhurried speed of someone who understood urgency without being rattled by it. "Queen Delacour," he said. His voice was gravel and brass. "We were not informed of a visit." "No," Seraphine agreed pleasantly. "You were not. I am Sharpclaw, senior teller on duty. How may Gringotts be of service? I require a full heritage verification on this child." Seraphine placed a hand briefly, gently on Harry's shoulder. "Harry James Potter. I am invoking blood sense rights under the Accords of Avalon." Sharpclaw's eyes moved to Harry. They were unreadable in the way that goblin expressions were always unreadable, not blank, but operating according to a different set of signals than human faces used. He looked at Harry for what felt like a while. "Director Ragnarok will want to be present," Sharpclaw said. "I expected nothing less," Seraphine said. They were shown, not ushered, shown. There was a difference, through a door Harry had never seen used, off to the left of the main hall, down a corridor that felt older than the main bank, walls that were actual stone rather than marble facing, and into a room that was spare and deliberate in its emptiness. A round table, 7 chairs, lamps mounted in stone brackets that burned with a steady white light that had no visible source. Harry sat where he was directed, between Seraphine and Fleur, who had indeed not been sent away. 3 of Seraphine's companions took chairs along the wall. Sharpclaw took a position near the door. And they waited, and the quality of the waiting was charged, like air before a storm. Ragnarok arrived 7 minutes later. Harry had expected something like Sharpclaw, senior, contained, professional. Ragnarok was all of those things and also something additional that Harry's 8-year-old vocabulary didn't quite have the word for. He was shorter than most of the tellers, broader, with a face that had lived in it, the deep lines of a creature who had spent a very long time dealing with a world that mostly underestimated him and had found this alternately useful and infuriating. He wore robes of deep charcoal with a Gringotts crest that was subtly, significantly different from the standard issue worn by the tellers. He walked into the room like he owned it, which, Harry supposed, was approximately accurate. His eyes, when they landed on Harry, were sharp as broken flint. "Harry Potter," Ragnarok said. He had a voice like stone grinding against stone, low and authoritative and entirely free of the performative deference that the Dursleys gave to people they were trying to impress. "I am the director of Gringotts, Britain. Do you understand what a heritage test is?" "Not really," Harry said. "It is a magical verification of your bloodline, your family connections, and any magical contracts or inheritances tied to your name or your blood. It requires a small amount of blood and it takes approximately 20 minutes. Ragnarok sat down across from Harry without looking to see if the chair was there. It was. "It will tell us the truth. No matter what the truth is. Do you consent?" The last 3 words were said with distinct emphasis, and Harry understood that the emphasis was deliberate, that consent mattered here in a way it apparently didn't in some other places Harry had been. "Yes," Harry said. "Good." Ragnarok produced a small crystal vial, a silver pin, and a piece of parchment that looked old enough to be a document rather than a page, heavy cream stock with an institutional seal pressed into the top. He slid them across the table. A drop of blood, pressed to the parchment. Harry took the pin, pressed the tip to his thumb, and pressed his thumb to the parchment. The blood hit the page and spread, not with the random patterning of liquid soaking into fiber, but with intent, thin lines moving outward from the drop like roots finding water, branching and curving, and then the lines began to darken and solidify and resolve into words and connections, a structure emerging from what had been blank page, a map of something. For 30 seconds the room was silent except for the quiet sound of lines being drawn by blood on parchment. Then Ragnarok leaned forward. His expression didn't change, goblins weren't readable in the way humans were, but something in the stillness of him altered, and Harry, who was good at reading the quality of stillness in people who had power over him, noticed it. Ragnarok looked at Seraphine. Seraphine looked back, and her expression said clearly that she had known, and that knowing had not made it smaller. "Director," Sharpclaw said from the door, his voice careful and flat, "should I get me Bonebreaker, Gold Vault, and the legal archive team?" Ragnarok said. "Now. All of them." He looked at Harry, and whatever was happening behind those flint-chip eyes was complicated and large. "And nobody goes in or out of this corridor without my direct authorization." Sharpclaw left without another word. Harry looked down at the parchment in front of him. The lines had finished drawing themselves. The family tree was there: James Potter, Lily Evans, their parents' parents, a traceable structure going back generations, exactly what he'd expected. It was what surrounded the family tree that was overwhelming the page. Lines radiating outward from his name, different in color from the black of direct bloodline, these were gold, and they went to places: names, crests, connected nodes on the parchment that were labeled not with family names but with titles. Seats. Positions. Things with old words around them, Latin and something older than Latin, words that had the weight of legal documents that had been signed when the signing of legal documents was a sacred act rather than an administrative one. Harry counted the gold lines. He counted them twice. "There are 27, he said. "Yes," Seraphine said quietly. "What are they?" Ragnarok sat back in his chair, and the deliberateness of the movement was that of someone organizing a very large and very unwelcome thing into communicable form. "They are lordship seats," he said. "Magical family seats, each of which carries voting rights in the Wizengamot, hereditary land claims, family vaults, and in the case of these particular seats," he tapped the parchment with one blunt finger, "Veela blood bond sovereignty rights. Ancient agreements between your family line and the Veela courts. Each of these seats was held by your family, through one branch or another, going back in some cases 800 years. Harry looked at the 27 gold lines spreading from his name. "Was held," he said. "They're not now?" "No." Ragnarok's voice was very level. The levelness was doing a lot of work. "At present, 27 seats which belong by blood and magical right to the House of Potter and its connected lines are being held, occupied, by other families. Some through claimed purchases. Some through blood adoption documents." A pause. "Some through circumstances that I will be investigating with considerable personal interest." "Someone stole them," Harry said. "Yes." "Who?" Ragnarok looked at him steadily. "That is what I intend to find out." Then, more quietly, "Some names are already visible in the preliminary trace. Malfoy. Not. Parkinson. Bones, in one complicated case that I believe was not fully voluntary. Greengrass. Burke." He listed them the way you'd list items in an inventory, precisely, without inflection, which somehow made it worse. Fleur, beside Harry, had been silent through all of this. She said now, in French, something low and sharp, and the word Harry caught was voler, to steal. 3 of the 27, Seraphine said, her voice still warm but with steel running through the warmth like rebar through concrete, carry direct Veela blood bond sovereignty rights. They are not merely property claims. They are bonds that affect my court's legal standing in any magical treaty negotiation with Britain. She folded her hands on the table with perfect composure. Whoever holds those seats illegitimately has been voting in Wizengamot matters that affect Veela sovereignty for, how long, Director? The oldest fraudulent registration I can see in the preliminary trace is 1971, Ragnarok said. But some of these go back further. The Gringotts records will need full auditing. Another pause, heavier. I will be conducting that audit personally. Harry sat with all of this for a moment. 27 seats that were his. 27 things taken, registered under other names, voting and being represented and generating whatever wealth and power those things generated, and none of it going anywhere near him. Him, in Dudley's enormous jeans, with a piece of rope for a belt. He wasn't angry yet. He would be, he suspected, when there was space for it. Right now there was something more immediate and more useful, the clear, cold awareness that the world had a shape he hadn't known about, and that the shape had people's names in it, and that the people's names were recorded. Goblins kept records. What happens now? Harry asked. Now, Ragnarok said, I file an emergency injunction freezing the use of all 27 seats, pending investigation. His expression, for the first time, shifted, not into warmth, exactly, but into something that might have been satisfaction of the deeply professional kind. Under Gringotts banking law, this is entirely within my authority. Any family currently occupying a contested seat will be notified that their claim is under formal review. Dumbledore, Seraphine said, and the name landed in the room with a weight that suggested she'd been holding it for a while. Ragnarok met her eyes. There is a note on the Potter Vault account, he said, dating to 1981. Signed by Albus Dumbledore as Magical Guardian. I cannot yet determine what permissions it granted. The level voice had a slight edge now. I will determine it. The door opened. Sharpclaw returned, followed by 3 more goblins Harry hadn't seen before, the legal archive team, Harry assumed, from the way they moved with the specific energy of people who had been pulled away from something and were now preparing to throw themselves at a different something with complete focus. McGonagall arrived 30 seconds later, slightly out of breath, her apothecary bag still in her hand. She took in the room. She took in the parchment on the table. She took in Ragnarok's expression and Seraphine's composed certainty and Harry sitting in the middle of it all, looking up at her with those 2 attentive green eyes, and something shifted in her face that Harry didn't entirely understand, not quite guilt, but the cousin of guilt, the expression of someone confronting the possibility that what they thought was careful attention might have been the wrong kind. The owl reached Albus, she said. He'll be here within the hour. Good, Seraphine said. That will give Director Ragnarok time to prepare the preliminary findings. McGonagall looked at Harry. Are you all right, Potter? Yes, Harry said. And then, because it was true, I've been given more information in the last 20 minutes than I've had my entire life. It's a lot. But I'm all right. McGonagall made a sound that wasn't quite speech. She sat down in the remaining empty chair, set her bag on the floor, straightened her robes, and pressed her lips into the thinnest of lines. Ragnarok was already working, the legal team spreading documents across the table, a second and larger parchment unrolling itself to accommodate the scope of what was being traced. Harry watched it happen, watched the gold lines multiply as deeper records were pulled, watched names accumulate beside stolen seats, watched the magnitude of it render itself in ink and magic with the impartial thoroughness of a system that had been built to record everything and forget nothing. Fleur leaned slightly toward him and said, quietly enough that only he could hear, "Are you actually all right? You do not have to say yes for their benefit." Harry considered this. It was a surprisingly careful question from someone he'd known for 20 minutes. "I think I'm all right," he said, just as quietly. "It's just, a lot to understand at once. That there were 27 things and they're all just, gone. That people have been using them." He paused. "That no one told me." Fleur's jaw set in a way he recognized, not quite anger, but the controlled edge of it. "No," she said, with precise emphasis. "No one told you." There was something very solid in the way she said it. Something that suggested this was now, officially, a problem she had opinions about. Outside, in the corridor, Harry could hear the bank resuming its normal business, transactions and footsteps and the distant underground boom. The world going about itself, entirely unaware that in a room off a stone corridor in Gringotts, a boy with a piece of rope for a belt in his father's eyes was looking at 27 gold lines on ancient parchment and beginning to understand that the story of his life was considerably larger and considerably more stolen from than anyone had let him know. He did not look away from the parchment. He was good at that. Not looking away. One of the legal team goblins pushed a fresh piece of parchment across to Ragnarok and murmured something. Ragnock read it, and for just a moment, the professional composure cracked. Not much, just a hairline fracture, but enough for Harry to see what was underneath, which was a fury so controlled it had become something very close to cold. Ragnock looked up at Seraphine. "There is a 28th line," he said. Seraphine's amber eyes didn't widen exactly. But something in them changed, a deepening, a quality of recognition that was almost reverent. "Show me," she said. And Harry, watching her face, had the sudden, entirely irrational certainty that whatever was on that parchment was something she had wondered about for a very long time. Outside the door, someone knocked. Sharpclaw opened it, and the man on the other side was tall and white-haired and dressed in robes of deep blue, and he had half-moon spectacles and a long beard and the particular expression of a person who had arrived at a situation they'd hoped to prevent and was now, with great intelligence and great experience, calculating how to manage it instead. Harry looked at Albus Dumbledore. Dumbledore looked at Harry. Then Dumbledore looked at the parchment on the table, at the 27 gold lines and the beginning of the 28th, at Ragnock's face and Seraphine's composed certainty, and in the space of one breath, the expression of a man who had come to manage a situation became the expression of a man who understood that management was going to be considerably more complicated than anticipated. "Harry," Dumbledore said, warmly, the voice that Harry had been told was the most reassuring voice in the wizarding world. "I came as quickly as I could." "Hello," Harry said. It was not the response Dumbledore was expecting. Harry could tell because the warmth in the old man's eyes flickered, just briefly, recalibrating. He'd expected fear, perhaps. Or relief. Or the automatic deference that adults expected from 8-year-olds. Harry had been giving people the information they expected from him his entire life. It had never gotten him anywhere. He thought, watching Dumbledore's eyes recalibrate, that this was probably a good time to stop. "Thank you for coming," Seraphine said to Dumbledore, with the graciousness of someone who had no intention of letting the person she was being gracious to forget who was running this particular meeting. "Please sit down. Director Ragnock was just about to show us something rather important." Dumbledore sat. His expression was the picture of calm cooperation, and underneath the calm cooperation was something that moved carefully, the intelligence of a man thinking 3 exchanges ahead. He looked at Harry once more, briefly, and what was in that look was complicated enough that Harry filed it away to think about later. Ragnock spread the second parchment on the table so that everyone could see it. The 28th line was different from the others. Not gold, it was silver, and it didn't branch outward from Harry's name toward a stolen seat somewhere else. It pointed inward, toward a connection that ran not along family lines but along something older and differently fundamental, a thread of magic that tied Harry's name to a notation on the parchment that was written not in English or in Latin but in the old runic script of the Veela courts themselves. The room was very quiet. "What does it say?" Harry asked. Seraphine answered him, and her voice, always composed, was now something else entirely, careful, and wondering, and carrying the weight of something she'd half believed for years and was now holding in her hands for the first time. "It says," she told him, "that 400 years ago, a Veela queen created a seat. Not inherited, not taken. Created. And she sealed it against time. A breath. And she wrote a name into the seal." "Whose name?" Harry asked. Seraphine's amber eyes looked at him across the table, and what was in them was not just the recognition of a theft to be corrected but something much older and much larger, the recognition of a pattern completing itself. "Yours," she said. Chapter 2, The Ledger of Stolen Crowns. The silence after Seraphine's words had a specific texture to it, the kind that doesn't come from nothing happening but from too many things happening at once, inside too many people, all at the same time. Dumbledore was the first to move. He reached forward and turned the parchment toward himself with the slow, deliberate care of a man who wanted to look at something before he decided what to say about it. His half-moon spectacles caught the lamplight as he bent to study the runic notation, and his expression was the most difficult thing Harry had looked at in a room full of difficult expressions, because it wasn't surprised. It was the expression of a man confirming something, not discovering it. Harry noticed that. He put it somewhere careful. Remarkable, Dumbledore said, and the word was warm and measured and gave nothing away. Isn't it? Ragnarok said flatly. Dumbledore looked up at the goblin director over his spectacles. Something passed between them, not a challenge exactly, but the mutual acknowledgement of two very experienced entities recognizing that the other one knew more than they were currently saying. Then Dumbledore sat back, folded his hands on the table, and turned the full warmth of his attention on Harry. Harry, he said. This is a great deal of information to receive all at once. How are you feeling? I'm fine, Harry said. He'd said it so many times in his life, to so many people, that it came out with the automatic ease of a reflex. Then he reconsidered. Actually, I'd like to understand the parchment before we talk about how I'm feeling. What is a lordship seat, exactly? Not just what it does, what it is. McGonagall made a small sound. Fleur, in Harry's peripheral vision, sat up slightly straighter. Dumbledore blinked, just once. Well, it is a hereditary magical title, representing a family's claim to, I know the definition, Harry said. He didn't know why he interrupted, exactly, except that the definition felt like the beginning of a detour and he didn't want a detour. I mean, if there are 27 of them and they all have my blood on them, and other people have been using them, what does using them mean? What have they been doing with them? Ragnarok leaned forward, and the quality of his attention sharpened. He was, Harry sensed, genuinely pleased by the question, or whatever the goblin equivalent of pleased was. Each seat carries several distinct powers, he said. Voting rights in the Wizengamot, Britain's magical governing body. Some seats carry 1 vote, some carry 2, and 3 of your 27 carry what are called weighted votes, meaning their holder has 3 times the legislative influence of an ordinary member. Additionally, each seat carries access to the family vault attached to it, hereditary land holdings, and in the specific case of the Veela bonded seats, treaty participation rights. He paused. The individuals currently registered as holders of these seats have been exercising all of these powers for, in some cases, over 50 years. Harry did the arithmetic, not because he needed to but because it helped him think. 27 seats. Some with double or triple votes. 50 years. He thought about what 50 years of votes in a governing body could accomplish, with all of those votes pointing in whatever direction the people who'd stolen them wanted them to point. Who's had the most? He asked. Of the 27? Ragnarok's expression was as close to grim satisfaction as Harry had seen it. He appreciated that the director didn't soften things. The Malfoy family currently holds 3 seats. All acquired between 1971 and 1979. A pause that carried freight. Lucius Malfoy has been voting those 3 seats in the Wizengamot for the past several years, since his father Abraxas passed the holdings to him. He is also, Seraphine said, her voice precisely level, one of the 3 families holding a Veela blood bond seat. Which means, Fleur said, unable to contain it, he has been participating in treaty negotiations that affect our court. Voting on matters that concern us. As if he had the right. The last 5 words came out with a precise, cold fury that was entirely more controlled than her age suggested she could manage. Yes, Seraphine said. She put one hand briefly on Fleur's wrist, not a restraint, just an acknowledgement. Dumbledore cleared his throat. I think before we proceed any further, he said, in the gentle, reasonable voice of someone gently and reasonably steering a situation, we should consider, with respect, Headmaster, Ragnarok said, and his tone made it clear that the respect was a formal courtesy and nothing more. The moment the heritage test was completed and signed, this became an active Gringotts investigation. Procedure does not pause for consideration. Dumbledore looked at him. Something in the old wizard's expression shifted minutely, the recalibration again, more visible this time. Of course, he said. I only meant, the note on the Potter vault, Harry said. Everyone looked at him. He looked at Dumbledore. Director Ragnarok said there's a note on my vault account. Signed by you. As my magical guardian. He paused. I didn't know you were my guardian. I am, Dumbledore said, and the gentleness in his voice was real. Harry thought. There was genuine care in it, but the gentleness was also, he noticed, deployed at the exact moment it would be most useful. After your parents died, Harry, I arranged your placement with your aunt and uncle. As head of the Wizengamot at the time and your parents chosen, my parents chose you? Harry asked. As my guardian? A pause. Brief. There was no formal will specifying otherwise, Dumbledore said. In the absence of a designated guardian, the Wizengamot, there was a will, Ragnarok said. The room went very still again. Dumbledore's expression didn't change, and the fact that it didn't change was its own kind of answer. There is a sealed document in the Potter secondary vault, Ragnarok continued, his voice carrying the flat certainty of someone reading from a record, filed under the date October 27, 1981. 2 days before the recorded date of James and Lily Potter's deaths. He looked at Dumbledore with eyes that were very old and very sharp. It has never been accessed. It has never been opened. A pause. It has been noted. Multiple times. The notation reads, pending review, and carries an authorization stamp from this bank's records office. Whose authorization stamp? McGonagall said. It was the first time she'd spoken since sitting down. Her voice was very controlled in a way that suggested considerable effort. She was looking at Dumbledore, and what was in her expression wasn't accusation yet, it was the look of someone who doesn't want to arrive at the conclusion their reasoning is pointing toward and is checking, very carefully, whether there's another route. Ragnarok met her eyes. The stamp is from the Office of the Magical Guardian of Record. Dated November 15, 1981. He let that sit. 6 weeks after it was filed. McGonagall said nothing. She looked at Dumbledore for a long moment, and Dumbledore looked back at her, and what passed between them was too layered for Harry to fully read, but one thread of it was clear enough. She was asking him something without words, and his answer was the absence of denial. Albus, she said. Just the name. Just that. Minerva. Just as quiet. And then, to the room, I acted in what I believed were the best interests of Harry's safety. Given the circumstances of 1981, with Voldemort's supporters still active and dangerous, any formal will declaring Harry's guardianship would have been a target. A map for those who wished him harm. He looked at Harry, and the care in his eyes was genuine. Harry was certain of that, but genuine care and good decisions weren't the same thing, and Dumbledore had made a decision in 1981 that had resulted in Harry spending 8 years in Dudley's second bedroom. I kept you safe, Harry. You kept me hidden, Harry said. The distinction felt important. He wasn't angry yet, he was still taking inventory, still cataloging. Who are my guardians? In the will? I don't know, Dumbledore said, and the words were very slightly more careful than everything else he'd said. I do, Ragnarok said. He was watching Dumbledore with the focused, impartial attention of a predator that has identified something and is deciding the best approach. Sirius Orain Black is listed as primary guardian. Remus John Lupin as secondary. The name Sirius Black hit the room like a stone hitting water. McGonagall flinched. Dumbledore closed his eyes for 1 second, just one, and when he opened them again the composure was still there but it was working harder. Sirius Black is in Azkaban, Dumbledore said. Convicted of the murder of, convicted without a trial, Ragnarok said, and those 4 words were the most devastating thing said in the room so far, because they were said without emotion and with complete authority and they clearly came from a record. Gringotts has standing access to Wizengamot proceedings as part of our estate management responsibilities. There is no trial record for Sirius Orain Black. He was imprisoned by the direct order of then-Minister Bartemius Crouch Sr., November 1, 1981. Another pause. The day after Harry Potter was placed with the Dursley family. McGonagall stood up. She did it suddenly enough that her chair scraped back across the stone floor. She stood there, very straight, very still, her hands flat on the table, and the expression on her face had passed through the cousin of guilt and arrived somewhere considerably less comfortable. "He has been in Azkaban for 7 years, she said, and her voice was doing the thing voices do when they're trying to hold together and succeeding mostly through determination, without a trial. "Yes," Ragnox said. "And Harry's guardianship was never legally transferred from Sirius Black, because there was no trial, no conviction, and no formal legal process through which the guardianship could have been reassigned." Ragnox looked at Dumbledore. "Which means, Headmaster, that your authority as magical guardian of Harry Potter was never legally established." "Which means," Seraphine said, and her voice was the quiet that comes before something very large, "that every decision made about this child's life, his placement, his access to his family history, his knowledge of these seats, was made without legal authority." She looked at Dumbledore, and there was no hostility in her face. What was there was worse, a clear-eyed recognition without judgment, which somehow stripped the situation of every comfortable ambiguity. "You have been making choices for him, Albus. For 8 years. That were not yours to make." Dumbledore looked at Harry. Harry looked back. "I'm not angry," Harry said, because it was still true and he thought it was important to be accurate. "I think I will be, later. But right now I just want to understand everything." He looked at Ragnox. "The 27th seat. Can you tell me how each one was taken? Not just who has them, how it was done." Ragnox looked at him for a moment that felt like an assessment. Then he nodded once, the decisive nod of someone making a decision. He turned to the legal team and said 2 words in gobbledygook, and the archive goblin spread out across the table like a practiced formation, unrolling documents that smelled of age and deliberate preservation, records that had been kept with the obsessive precision of a species for whom record-keeping was not bureaucracy but honor. "We will go through each one," Ragnox said. "This will take time." "That's fine," Harry said. "I have time." What followed was 2 hours of the most concentrated information Harry had ever been handed, and he sat through all of it with the stillness of someone who has learned that the best way to absorb something large is to make yourself very quiet and let it fill you. The methods varied. Some were elegant in their straightforwardness, forged blood adoption papers, where a family had manufactured documentation claiming magical adoption of a child from Harry's bloodlines, thus creating a spurious inheritance claim strong enough to register with Gringotts during a period of post-war administrative chaos when the bank's verification processes had been, as Ragnox put it with surgical precision, inadequately maintained. 3 seats had gone this route. The Parkinson family held 1. The Knott family held 2, both acquired in 1979. Others were more complicated. 2 seats had been transferred through what were documented as voluntary magical contract agreements, essentially, members of Harry's extended family line signing over their seat rights under oaths that, when Ragnox's team pulled the original contract language, contained coercion clauses buried in archaic legal phrasing, the kind that could be buried because the person signing had been under a compulsion charm, or had been deceived about what they were signing, or had signed in the kind of desperation that made anything feel like a better option than the alternative being presented. The Greengrass acquisition, Ragnox said, pushing a contract document across the table to Harry, was through a marriage agreement. A female member of one of your family lines, a third cousin, twice removed, of the Potter line, was contracted to marry into the Greengrass family in 1965. The marriage contract included a clause, written in archaic inheritance transfer language, that rerouted her hereditary seat rights to her husband upon marriage. The clause was not standard. He paused. It was specifically drafted. The Greengrass family solicitor at the time was also, we find, the same solicitor who drafted 2 of the Knott contracts. Is the solicitor still alive? Seraphine asked. No. He died in 1982. Ragnox said this without inflection, but something in the timing made Harry's skin prickle. The 3 Malfoy seats were saved for last, and Harry thought that was probably deliberate. The first Malfoy seat, Ragnock said, was acquired through forged blood adoption papers in 1971, registered under Abraxas Malfoy. The forgery is sophisticated. It passed Gringotts verification at the time because it was supported by a false Wisengamot record that confirmed the adoption. The Wisengamot record was signed by 3 members, all of whom were, in 1971, on a gift-receiving record from the Malfoy family vault. He stopped. Let that register. The second seat was acquired via compelled contract in 1974. The third, the Veela blood bond seat, was acquired in 1979, through a document that is, on its surface, a purchase agreement. You can't purchase a Veela blood bond seat, Seraphine said quietly. No, Ragnock agreed. You cannot. The document is fraudulent on multiple levels. It claims the agreement of a Veela representative, whose name, upon investigation, belongs to a member of your court who died in 1962. He looked at Seraphine. 17 years before the document was signed. Fleur exhaled sharply. The French word she used was not, Harry suspected, one he'd find in a schoolbook. The person who signed it, Seraphine said. On behalf of, whoever orchestrated this. The signature is difficult to trace, Ragnock said. The notary who witnessed it has also, like the solicitor, died. 1981, he looked at the document. Also, we note, not before receiving a payment from the Malfoy family vault that is logged in our records as a consulting fee. The room was quiet. Harry looked at the 3 Malfoy documents laid out in front of him. He looked at the sophistication of them, the layers of false support, the witnesses, the coerced records, the conveniently timed deaths. This wasn't opportunism. This was a campaign. Someone had looked at the structure of magical inheritance law, understood it deeply, and built a systematic program of theft inside the framework of the system meant to prevent theft. How long was this being planned, he asked. Ragnock looked at the earliest document. The first Malfoy acquisition was 1971. But the solicitor who drafted the Greengrass contract was active as early as 1960. If we include that as part of the same campaign, then at minimum 15 to 20 years. He turned a page. Some of the underlying family seats targeted go back further, the legal groundwork, the establishing of false precedents in smaller Wisengamot matters that created the framework for later, larger claims. If I had to give you a full estimate of the planning horizon, he stopped. Tell me, Harry said. Perhaps 40 years, Ragnock said. Perhaps more. This was not one person's work. This was a project. Something cold settled in Harry's chest, not fear, not quite, more like the sensation of a landscape revealing itself to be much larger than the piece of it you were standing on. Voldemort, Dumbledore said quietly. He'd been almost entirely silent for the past 90 minutes, listening, and the quality of his listening had been careful in the way Harry was beginning to recognize as characteristic, absorbing everything, giving nothing back, calculating. The systematic acquisition of political power through precisely these methods was consistent with Voldemort's agenda. He paused. Though some of these acquisitions predated even his rise to significant power. The infrastructure was being built. For him, McGonagall said. For whoever was building his support base, Dumbledore said carefully. Many of these families were his supporters, yes. The concentration of Wisengamot voting power in the hands of that particular group is significant. He looked at Harry. With 27 seats restored to you, Harry, the current balance of the Wisengamot would shift considerably. Which is why, Harry said, someone should have told me about this a long time ago. Dumbledore met his eyes and this time the warmth was quieter, less deployed. Yes, he said. I think that's fair. It was so straightforward that it caught Harry off guard. He'd been braced for another careful detour, another reason, another layer of justification. The plain admission sat between them, and Harry looked at it, and it didn't fix anything but it was real. What happens to the seats now? He asked Ragnok. I file the injunction today. It freezes all 27 seats immediately. No holder can exercise any powers associated with those seats until the investigation is complete and the claims are adjudicated. Ragnok steepled his fingers. I will also be filing a formal fraud notification with the Wisengamot's Records Office, the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, and, given the Veela blood bond seats, with the International Confederation of Wizards. And how long will the adjudication take? Seraphine asked. For an ordinary claim, 6 months to a year. Ragnok's expression was sharp. This is not an ordinary claim. There are 27 seats, documented fraud, at minimum 3 confirmed forgeries, evidence of coercion, and 2 conveniently dead witnesses. I will be requesting emergency proceedings. He paused. I will also, personally, be requesting that the Wisengamot investigation into Sirius Black's imprisonment be reopened. McGonagall looked up. You have the authority to request that? Gringotts has the authority to request review of any Wisengamot proceeding that affected the legal management of a registered vault holder's estate, Ragnok said. Harry Potter is a registered vault holder. The imprisonment of his legal guardian, without trial, directly affected the management of his estate. His expression was something approaching satisfaction. Yes, Professor McGonagall. I have the authority. Harry sat back in his chair. He became aware, for the first time in 2 hours, that he was hungry and that the stone-walled room had no windows and that he had absolutely no idea what time it was. He'd come into Diagon Alley to trail behind the Dursleys while Vernon looked for a pocket watch. He had not expected this to be his Tuesday. What do I need to do? He asked. Today, nothing more than you've already done, Ragnok said. You gave blood consent for the test. You've been present for the preliminary findings. Your presence here is itself legally significant, it establishes your awareness and consent to the investigation. He reached into the documents and produced a smaller piece of parchment. I will need you to sign this. It authorizes Gringotts to conduct the full investigation on your behalf and to freeze the contested seats. He slid it across with the silver pin. Harry read it. Not quickly, carefully, going back over the phrases that were ambiguous, the ones that had multiple possible meanings. He'd watched Ragnok spend 2 hours showing him exactly how dangerous it was to sign things without understanding them. Ragnok watched him read. The expression on the director's face, Harry thought, was something that might have been respect, though it was a very goblin kind of respect, entirely without sentimentality but absolutely genuine. Paragraph 3, Harry said. It says Gringotts may take necessary measures to secure contested properties. What does necessary measures mean? Ragnok looked at paragraph 3. It means that if a family currently holding a contested seat attempts to liquidate assets tied to that seat during the investigation, Gringotts can freeze those assets directly. He looked at Harry. It's a standard protection clause. Then it should say that, Harry said. Can you write what you just said into the document instead of necessary measures? Another pause, longer than the previous ones. Ragnok looked at him for a moment. Then he took the parchment back, made a notation, and pushed it across again with the crisp efficiency of someone who had made a decision he was comfortable with. Harry read the amended paragraph. Then he signed. Fleur, who had been watching the entire exchange with an expression of sharp attention, said very quietly, just to him, "That was well done." "I just said what I meant," Harry said. "Yes," she said. "People often don't." Seraphine stood, and the room reorganized itself around her rising the way it had around her walking, naturally, immediately. "Director Ragnok," she said. "I will be filing our own parallel documentation through the Veela Court's treaty office today. The 3 sovereignty seats are a matter of international law, and I intend to ensure they are treated as such." "Understood," Ragnok said. "We will coordinate." "Thank you." She looked at Dumbledore with the same clear-eyed composure she'd had throughout. "Albus. I trust you understand that this investigation proceeds regardless of any other considerations." "Of course," Dumbledore said. He stood as well. He was very tall, and the blue robes and the white beard and the half-moon spectacles all combined to make him look, Harry thought, like someone who'd been built specifically to look like a person that other people defer to. But Harry had spent 2 hours watching that composure navigate around facts it couldn't argue with and manage its reaction to things it had clearly known. He found, rather calmly, that he didn't defer to it. "Harry," Dumbledore said. "Would you walk with me?" "There are things." "Not today," Harry said. Dumbledore looked at him, and the pause that followed had several things in it. Surprise was one of them, but it was a small surprise, the surprise of someone who'd identified the possibility and was now confirming it. "There is a great deal I'd like to explain to you," he said. "About your parents. About why I made the choices I made." "I know," Harry said. "And I think you should. But not today. Today I need to think about what I've just heard." He looked at the headmaster steadily. "I'd like to read the will first. Before we talk about anything else." Dumbledore looked at him for a long moment. Then he nodded, and the nod was not a performance, it was a man acknowledging something he'd possibly known was coming and finding that it had arrived. "Of course," he said. "When you're ready." He and McGonagall left together. At the door, McGonagall paused and looked back at Harry with an expression he couldn't entirely interpret, complicated, and carrying a quality of something she might have wanted to say but hadn't found the shape of yet. Then the door closed. Harry looked at the table. The documents. The parchment with 27 gold lines. The silver line of the 28th that went inward instead of outward, toward something created rather than stolen, toward a name written 400 years ago. "The 28th seat," he said to Seraphine. "You started to explain before Dumbledore arrived. Will you explain it now?" Seraphine sat back down without any ceremony. She looked at the silver line, and the quality of her expression was that of someone approaching something they'd approached before, in their mind, many times, and are now finally approaching in reality. 400 years ago, she said, the Veela queen of that time, her name was Isidora, was the most powerful seer our court has ever produced. She didn't have visions in the ordinary sense. She had what we call threadsight, the ability to perceive the connections between people and events across time. Not specific events. The structure of things. The way causes lead to consequences. Harry listened. She created a seat, Seraphine continued, that she called the seat of the returned. She told her court that one day a child would be born whose blood carried ancient Veela bonds that had been severed, and that this child would come to restore what had been taken, not just from themselves, but from others. She sealed the seat with her own magic and wrote a name into it. She paused. Not a name as we know names. A magical designation. A bloodline identifier. And it matches mine. It matches yours precisely. Seraphine's amber eyes held his. Isidora left a record of why she created it. She wrote that the child would arrive in a time when the old families had grown corrupt, when power had been accumulated through theft and fear and systemic control, and that the child would be the mechanism through which the old balance was restored. She tilted her head slightly. She also wrote, and this part, I admit, I have always found striking, that the child would be unremarkable in appearance and would not know their own significance, and that this was important. That a child who didn't know their own power couldn't be shaped by it too early. I don't know that I have power, Harry said. You have 27 stolen lordship seats, Seraphine said. And a 28th created for you by a Veela queen seer 4 centuries ago. You have Veela blood bonds running so deep in your magical core that I felt them from 30 feet away through a crowd of 100 people. She looked at him with the kind of directness that was its own form of respect. You have power, Harry. The question is what you choose to do with it. Gabrielle Delacour, who had spent the entire 2 hours sitting in a chair 3 feet from Harry and had been so quiet that everyone in the room had effectively forgotten she existed, chose this moment to speak. She was 7 years old, with hair the color of winter sunlight and enormous blue eyes, and she had spent the last 2 hours watching Harry with the focused, unself-conscious concentration of a small animal that has identified something important. "I knew," she announced, with complete confidence. "I told Maman you were important." On the street. Before Grandmere walked over. Fleur looked at her. "You did not say that." "I thought it," Gabrielle said serenely. Very loudly. "That is not the same, he is going to be my best friend," Gabrielle said, with the absolute certainty of someone for whom the word maybe simply doesn't register. She looked at Harry. "You don't mind. Do you?" It was not, strictly speaking, a question. Harry looked at this 7-year-old who had spent 2 hours sitting in a high-stakes legal proceeding and had processed the entire experience primarily in terms of its implications for her social life. Something in his chest, which had been tight since the moment he'd looked at 27 gold lines on parchment, did something complicated and soft. "No," he said. "I don't mind." Fleur pressed her lips together in the specific expression of an older sibling whose dignity has been compromised by association. Ragnarok, gathering his documents on the other side of the table, permitted himself what was technically not a smile but occupied some adjacent territory. "Mr. Potter," he said. "I will have preliminary findings ready within 48 hours. You should return here in 3 days with, given the absence of legal guardianship, a trusted adult representative." He paused. "Given the circumstances, I would suggest Queen Delacour." "I would be honored to serve as Harry's representative in Gringotts proceedings," Seraphine said, as if she'd been expecting the question. She probably had. "Harry, does that suit you?" "Yes," Harry said. Then, because something Ragnarok had said was still sitting in him, "in 3 days. Does that mean I go back to the Dursleys tonight?" The room shifted. Nobody had said anything, but the shift was there. "Yes," Ragnarok said. "The injunction will be filed today, but until the investigation is formalized, there is no legal mechanism to change your living situation immediately. I will say," and here his voice took on a precise, deliberate quality, "that I will also be filing a secondary investigation notice to the Wizengamot regarding the management of the Potter estate under unofficial guardianship. That investigation will include the living conditions of the estate's heir." He held Harry's gaze. "Things that are noticed tend to be addressed." It wasn't a promise. It was something better, the statement of a person who intended to do a specific thing and was telling you so you'd know to expect it. "Thank you," Harry said. He stood up, and the standing up felt different from the sitting down. He was the same height, still unremarkable, still wearing Dudley's jeans with rope for a belt, but there was something about the quality of how he occupied the space he was standing in that had changed in the past 2 hours. Not larger. Just more precisely himself. Seraphine walked out with him into the main hall of Gringotts, Fleur and Gabrielle falling in on either side. The bank was still running at full operational speed, transactions, tellers, the deep underground boom, and nobody looked at Harry as he crossed the marble floor, which was as it should be. He was 8 years old and wore borrowed clothes that didn't fit. At the main entrance, Seraphine stopped and crouched again, the way she had in the alley, to his eye level. Up close, the amber eyes were very calm. 3 days, she said. Come back in 3 days. Bring nothing except yourself. She paused. Can you manage, in the interim? Yes, Harry said. If anything changes, she said, and the phrasing was careful, in a way that makes returning in 3 days difficult, send word to Gringotts. Director Ragnarok will ensure I receive it. Harry nodded. And Harry. She reached into the folds of her robe and produced something, a small coin, old gold, stamped with a crest he didn't recognize. She pressed it into his hand. Veela court token. If you hold it and think of me, I will know. I will not be able to come immediately, but I will know. Her eyes were very direct. You are not alone in this. That is the important thing to understand. Whatever else happens, you are not alone. Harry looked at the coin in his palm. The metal was warm, warmer than it should have been from just being in a pocket. He closed his fingers around it. Okay, he said. Outside, Diagon Alley had returned to itself, noise and movement and the layered, living quality of a place full of magic. The Dursleys were nowhere visible. They'd given up waiting, Harry suspected, or had perhaps been waiting somewhere else entirely. He'd find them or find his way home. He always managed. He walked out into the sun, the coin warm in his fist, 27 lines of gold on a parchment somewhere behind him, and a silver line that went 400 years in the other direction. He had a great deal to think about. He had, for the first time in his life, a great deal to think with. That was new. And strange. And something he was going to need some time to sit with before the anger arrived, as he suspected it would, like a tide coming in, patient and inevitable and, when it finally got here, very large. 3 days. He could manage 3 days. Chapter 3, The Weight of Crowns. 3 days felt like 3 years. Harry spent the first night lying on his cot in the cupboard under the stairs, staring at the underside of the steps and doing arithmetic. Not school arithmetic, real arithmetic, the kind where the numbers meant something. 27 seats. 50 years of votes. He thought about what 50 years of votes in a governing body could build, the laws passed and blocked, the policies shaped, the appointments made, all of it running through 27 conduits that should have been his and had been pointed somewhere else entirely. He thought about the Dursleys in the next room. Petunia making tea in the kitchen with her sharp, economic movements. Vernon watching television with the volume up because he could. Dudley existing in the loose, comfortable way of someone for whom the world had always arranged itself conveniently. He thought about the coin, warm in his hand, and fell asleep with his fingers closed around it. The next 2 days were unremarkable in the specific way that the Dursleys engineered unremarkability: chores, silence, Dudley eating everything Harry wasn't fast enough to reach at meals, Vernon making comments about abnormality, all of it operating according to the usual rules. Harry did everything asked of him and said almost nothing and spent every available mental moment organizing what he knew into something he could use. Because that was the thing, he had information now. Real information, specific and documented, with names and dates and goblin records behind it. He had been given, in 2 hours in a stone-walled room, more of his own story than 8 years of living had produced. He didn't intend to waste any of it. He also thought about Dumbledore. He thought about it carefully, without letting himself tip into the simplicity of anger. Because Dumbledore had done something, had made choices that were, by any measure, wrong, choices that had kept Harry ignorant and isolated and undersized and fed on leftovers for 8 years. And those choices had been made by a man who was, by every account Harry had encountered, brilliant and powerful and genuinely devoted to the good of the wizarding world. Which meant the choices weren't careless. They were deliberate. They were the choices of someone who decided he knew what was best and had acted accordingly. Harry found that considerably more interesting, and considerably more worth thinking about, than simple malice would have been. Simple malice he'd have known what to do with. This was something more complicated. By the 3rd morning he was ready. He told Aunt Petunia he needed to go to Diagon Alley. She looked at him, then looked at the space over his left shoulder the way she always looked at him, never quite at, and said, "Don't cause trouble," which was her version of permission. He took the bus to the leaky cauldron, tapped the brick wall with the penknife he'd found behind the loose floorboard under his cot 2 years ago, and walked through. Seraphine was already there. She was standing just inside the entrance to Diagon Alley in the gold-white light she seemed to carry with her like a second layer of clothing, and she was alone except for one companion, a tall Veela woman of perhaps 30, with the efficient bearing of someone whose job was to be alert so that Seraphine didn't have to spend her attention on it. Fleur and Gabrielle were not with her, which Harry noticed and filed away as probably intentional. "You look better," Seraphine said, studying him with those amber eyes that missed nothing. "I slept," Harry said. "Good." She didn't ask whether the 3 days had been difficult. She probably already knew, and more importantly, she understood that asking about it in the middle of a street was not the same as caring about it. "Ragnarok is ready for us. The preliminary investigation is complete." They walked to Gringotts together, and the alley moved around them in the particular way it moved around Seraphine, not parting exactly, more like adjusting, the ambient noise and motion of the place reorganizing slightly to give her the space she occupied without being asked to. Ragnarok was waiting in the same stone-walled room, but it was different today. The table was covered. Every available surface held documents, and they were organized with a precision that suggested the director had spent a significant part of the past 72 hours in this room, which Harry suspected was exactly the case. There were also 2 goblins Harry hadn't met, introduced by Ragnarok as Gold Vault and Iron Scribe, the heads of Gringotts' legal department and records department respectively. Both looked at Harry with the same assessing focus Ragnarok always used, as if they were calibrating for something specific and finding the measurement interesting. "The preliminary investigation is complete," Ragnarok said, without preamble, which was already Harry's favorite thing about him. "The injunction freezing all 27 seats was filed 2 days ago. As of yesterday morning, the following families have been formally notified." He pushed a list across the table. Harry read it. Malfoy. Knott. Parkinson. Burke. Rosier. Selwyn. Flint. Crabbe. Goyle. Greengrass. Avery. Lestrange. Mulciber. And others, 14 more names that ranged from immediately familiar in the dark way that dark family names were familiar to entirely unknown, names that meant nothing to him yet but clearly meant a great deal in the circles where they moved. How did they react? Harry asked. "They have 72 hours from notification to file a counterclaim," Ragnarok said. "As of this morning, 3 have done so." He turned a page. "The Knott family has filed through the Wisengamot's Property Disputes Office, claiming prior legal purchase of their 2 seats. The claim cites documentation we have already identified as forged. I have forwarded our analysis to the Disputes Office." A pause with something in it. "The Greengrass family has filed a counterclaim acknowledging the irregularity of the original transfer and requesting negotiated resolution." "That's different," Seraphine observed. "Yes. It suggests the current head of the Greengrass family, Cyrus Greengrass, was not aware of the full circumstances of the original acquisition. Or is choosing to position himself as unaware." Ragnarok's expression was precise. "The 3rd counterclaim is from Lucius Malfoy." The name settled into the room. "He hasn't filed through the Disputes Office," Ragnarok continued. "He's filed directly with the full Wisengamot, requesting an emergency plenary session to contest the injunction on the grounds that it represents an improper exercise of Gringotts' authority into matters of magical governance." He looked at Harry. "He is claiming the injunction itself is illegal." "Is it?" Harry asked. "No," Ragnarok said, with a flatness that left no room for ambiguity. "But it is a sophisticated argument. It takes our legitimate authority and constructs a jurisdictional challenge around it that will require a Wisengamot session to formally dismiss." He paused. "Which is the point? Malfoy doesn't expect to win the jurisdictional argument. He expects the session to give him a platform." Harry thought about this. "He wants to make it a political argument instead of a legal one." Ragnarok looked at him. "Yes. Which means the Wisengamot session is the battlefield, not the courts." "Also yes." Ragnarok's expression was, again, doing the thing adjacent to satisfaction. "We have requested the emergency session for 2 weeks from today. In that time, I will have the full investigative report completed. Every fraudulent document identified, every forged signature traced, every coercion mechanism documented. We will go into that session with more evidence than the chamber has seen in a single proceeding in living memory. There is another matter, Goldvault said. His voice was higher than Ragnar's, precise and slightly formal. The will. Harry straightened. We accessed the Potter secondary vault yesterday, with the authorization you signed 3 days ago, Goldvault continued. He placed a sealed envelope on the table, cream-colored, old, with a wax seal that bore a stag. The will of James Charles Potter and Lily Juniper Potter, dated October 27, 1981. Harry looked at it. Just sat for a moment, looking at it. The seal was a stag, his father's animagus form, he would later learn, but right now it was just a stag, an image his parents had chosen to put on their most important document, an image he'd never seen before and that was already more of his parents than he'd had yesterday. Do you want privacy? Seraphine asked quietly. No, Harry said. No, I want, please stay. He broke the seal. The wax crumbled cleanly, and the parchment unfolded with the quality of something that had been waiting, not deteriorated, preserved, as if the magic in the seal had kept it in the exact state it was in the moment his parents had pressed their thumbs to the wax. His parents' handwriting was side by side, James's sprawling and slightly impatient, Lily's neat and forward-leaning. The will was co-signed, every clause witnessed and co-written, and the fact that they'd done it together, that there were 2 handwritings throughout instead of a primary and a secondary, told Harry something about them that he held quietly and didn't examine too closely because now was not the time. He read it through once, quickly. Then again, slowly. The primary provisions were clear, he was to be raised by Sirius Black, with Remus Lupin as secondary guardian. Under no circumstances, stated explicitly and underlined in James's handwriting, was Harry to be placed with Petunia Dursley. The underline was heavy enough to have nearly torn the page. There was a reason given, and it was blunt: she hates magic, she will hate him for it, and he deserves better than to be hated for what he is. Harry sat with that for exactly 3 seconds and then moved on because sitting with it longer right now would not be productive. The financial provisions were extensive: Gringotts' executor authority assigned to Sirius, a separate educational trust for Harry, and a list of the family seats with explicit guidance on reclamation if any were found to have been improperly transferred during the war years, which told him his father had known the seats were at risk. The Potters had known. They'd accounted for it in their will. At the bottom, below both their signatures and the witness marks, there was a handwritten note, separate from the formal document, added after, the ink a slightly different shade. It was in Lily's handwriting. Harry, if you're reading this, it means we couldn't be there. I'm sorry. That's inadequate, but it's true and I want you to have the true version of things, not the comfortable one. You are going to find out that you are more than we had time to tell you. There are things in your blood that go back further than us, further than your grandparents, further than anyone in our immediate world knew to look for. Be patient with the finding out. It's a lot. Your father wants me to add, don't let anyone tell you what you are before you've had a chance to decide for yourself. I think that's the most James thing he's ever said and I agree with every word of it. We love you. We're proud of you. Not for anything you've done, for what you are. For the specific, stubborn, bright person you are. Be exactly yourself. Harry set the parchment down on the table. The room was very quiet. He was not going to cry in Gringotts. He had decided this approximately 3 seconds into reading the note and he maintained the decision with some effort. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth once, briefly, then lowered it and looked up. Seraphine was watching him with an expression that was entirely uncomplicated, just present, just there, not trying to manage the moment or smooth it over or redirect it. Just witnessing it. Okay, Harry said. His voice was steady. He was mildly impressed with himself. What do we do about Sirius Black? Ragnar nodded once, as if he'd been waiting for this specific question with this specific timing and approved of both. I have already filed the investigation request with the Wisengamot. Given the unprecedented circumstances, no trial record, the connection to the Potter estate, and the evidence that his imprisonment directly violated the provisions of a legally filed will, the Department of Magical Law Enforcement is obligated to respond within 14 days. 14 days, Harry said. That's the same as the Wizengamot session. Yes, Ragnox said. This is not accidental. The door to the corridor opened. Sharpclaw leaned in, looked at Ragnox, and said 3 words in gobbledygook. Ragnox's eyes sharpened. It appears, he said, that we have a visitor. Lucius Malfoy is in the main hall requesting a meeting with the director regarding the Potter investigation. The room reoriented around the name. Seraphine's posture didn't change, but her expression did something, not tension, more like a door being closed on something. A preparation. Harry considered it. Can he do that? Just, come in and request a meeting? Any client can request a meeting with the director, Ragnox said. I am under no obligation to grant it. He looked at Harry. But it may be instructive. Do you object to meeting him? Harry thought about Lucius Malfoy. 3 stolen seats. A forged blood adoption. A compelled contract. A fraudulent Veela sovereignty document signed with a dead woman's name. A solicitor and a notary, both conveniently dead, both having received consulting fees from the Malfoy vault. A man who had voted Harry's stolen seats in the Wizengamot for years. No, Harry said. I don't object. Something moved across Ragnox's face that was, without question, appreciation. Lucius Malfoy entered the room 2 minutes later, and the first thing Harry noticed was how different he was from what the name had suggested. He'd built an image of someone loud and obvious, someone whose corruption wore itself on the outside because that was how the Dursleys' kind of wrongness worked, loud and obvious and entirely lacking in self-awareness. What walked through the door was nothing like that. Lucius Malfoy was tall, silver blonde, immaculately dressed in robes of grey so dark they were almost black, and he moved through the room with the kind of ease that comes not from confidence exactly but from a complete absence of doubt, the ease of someone who has never walked into a room and not owned it. He had a cane of black wood with a silver serpent head that he carried as an aesthetic choice rather than a necessity, and his face was handsome in the architectural way of people who've been bred for it over generations, all clean lines and deliberate symmetry. He looked at Ragnox first. Then at Seraphine, and his expression went very briefly neutral in a way that told Harry the Veela Queen's presence was not something he'd expected and was something he was filing quickly away as significant. Then he looked at Harry. Harry looked back. He was 8 years old, wearing Dudley's old clothes, sitting in a chair at a table covered in documents that contained exhaustive evidence of everything Lucius Malfoy had built. He did not look away. Something moved behind Malfoy's pale eyes, assessment, rapid and thorough, and beneath the assessment a reaction to what he found that he controlled very quickly but not quite quickly enough. Harry had spent 8 years reading the faces of people who had power over him and learning what it looked like when their read of a situation came back differently than expected. Lucius Malfoy had expected something else. He was managing the recalibration in real time. Director Ragnox, Malfoy said. His voice was smooth and low and deliberate, each word placed like a chess piece. I appreciate you seeing me. He glanced at Harry. And you must be young Harry Potter. I have been concerned about this situation. I wanted to offer my assistance in navigating. You hold 3 seats that belong to me, Harry said. Not loudly. Just clearly. The same voice he'd used in the alley with Seraphine, straightforward, accurate, without performance. Malfoy blinked. It was a very small blink. The matter of those seats, he said, recovering smoothly, is precisely what I hope to discuss. I believe there may be certain misunderstandings about the manner of their acquisition that could be. The acquisition of the first seat involved forged blood adoption papers, Harry said. He was not reading from the documents, he'd memorized them. Supported by a false Wizengamot record signed by 3 members who received gifts from your family vault. The second seat was acquired via compelled contract, and the compulsion clause was drafted by the same solicitor who drafted similar contracts for 3 other families currently under investigation. The third seat, the Veela blood bond seat, was acquired through a document that claims the agreement of a Veela representative who died 17 years before the document was signed. He paused. Which of those would you like to discuss? The silence that followed had a specific texture. Ragnok wasn't moving. Seraphine wasn't moving. Malfoy was very still, in the way of a person who has walked into a room expecting to be the most prepared person in it and has discovered they are not. "You are," Malfoy said, very carefully, "remarkably well informed for a child of 8. "Goblins keep good records," Harry said. "They do." Malfoy looked at Ragnok. "Director, I would note that some of this information, if broadly disseminated before the Wisengamot session, will be disseminated at the Wisengamot session," Ragnok said flatly. "In full. With documentation." Malfoy was quiet for one breath. 2. His face was entirely controlled, no anger visible, no fear, nothing that could be used against him later. This was a man who had spent decades operating in rooms where every expression was a negotiating position. "I see," he said. Then, to Harry, "I will say, Mr. Potter, that I bear no personal animosity toward you. You were a child when these matters originated, and whatever the records may suggest about the manner of acquisition, the individuals responsible, my father among them, are no longer in a position to account for themselves." He was building something as he spoke, Harry could feel it, a framework of deniability and misdirection and careful sympathy. "I have been administering these seats in good faith, on the basis of the registrations I inherited." Good faith would have included checking the documentation, Harry said. "You've been a Wisengamot member for years. You have access to property dispute records. The forged registration for the first seat has an authentication signature that doesn't match the authenticating official's known signature style, which is in the public Wisengamot record." He met Malfoy's eyes directly. "You knew." Another silence. Longer than the first. Malfoy looked at Harry Potter, 8 years old, in borrowed clothes, and what was in his eyes for just one moment before the composure came back was something complicated, not just the reassessment of a threat, but something almost like recognition. A man who understood, perhaps for the first time and perhaps somewhat against his will, that the thing sitting across the table from him was a specific kind of problem he had not encountered before. "This conversation," Malfoy said quietly, to Ragnok, "should have terms of confidentiality." "This conversation," Ragnok said, "is being recorded. As are all conversations in this room. That is standard Gringotts policy and was disclosed when you entered." He paused. "As it is every time you visit." Malfoy stood. He adjusted his cane, very slightly, with a precise movement that served no practical purpose but imposed a kind of punctuation on the moment. "I look forward to the Wisengamot session," he said, and it was the first thing he'd said that was entirely, genuinely true. "Good day, Director. Queen Delacour." He looked at Harry one last time. "Mr. Potter." He walked out. The door closed. Ragnok looked at Harry. He will spend the next 2 weeks attempting to locate leverage points, secure allies, and construct a narrative that turns the documented evidence into a matter of disputed interpretation. He paused. "He is very good at it." "I know," Harry said. But he didn't expect the specifics. "He came in here to see what we had, and now he knows we have everything." He thought about the look in Malfoy's eyes in that last moment. "He's going to try something else." "Yes," Seraphine said. "He will." She was watching Harry with an expression he was beginning to recognize, the Veela Queen's version of assessment, which was less cold than Ragnok's and more searching. As if she was looking for something she half expected to find and was watching the angle of it carefully. "The Wisengamot session," Harry said. "Can I attend?" Ragnok looked at him. "You have more Wisengamot voting rights than any single individual currently in the chamber. You not only can attend, your presence is legally significant. As the holder of the contested seats, your physical presence when the injunction is formally reviewed strengthens the claim. He paused. There are protocols. You would need to be formally introduced as a seat holder. That process involves, what does it involve? Presenting yourself before the full chamber. Speaking your name and your claim. Ragnarok met his eyes. No proxy. No representative speaking for you. You would stand in the Wizengamot and speak your own claim. Harry thought about standing in a chamber full of adults who had spent years operating on the assumption that the seats they held were theirs. Good, he said. That's what I want to do. Seraphine said something in French that was too fast for Harry to follow, and then, only then, she smiled. It was not the diplomatic warmth she'd shown the world. It was something private and genuine, a smile of someone recognizing the exact quality of something they'd been looking for. The meeting went on for another 2 hours. Documents reviewed, strategy discussed, the framework of the Wizengamot presentation built piece by careful piece. Ragnarok moved through it with the systematic thoroughness of a craftsman. Harry listened, asked questions, pushed back twice on points of strategy where his read differed from the initial approach, and was right both times in ways that Ragnarok acknowledged with the particular goblin nod of someone updating an assessment. By mid-afternoon they were done for the day, and Harry was walking out through the main hall of Gringotts when the main entrance opened and 2 people came in who had clearly been waiting outside long enough to have developed opinions about it. Fleur walked in like she owned the building. Gabrielle walked in like she owned everything, including the building and everyone in it, and had simply been delayed from announcing this by logistical complications. You were in there for 4 hours, Fleur said to Harry. It was not quite a complaint. More of an observation stated with feeling. There was a lot to cover, Harry said. Grandmere said we were not required at today's session, Fleur said. I disagreed. You were outvoted, Seraphine said mildly, coming up behind Harry. Only technically. Fleur fell into step beside Harry as they headed toward the exit. Well? What happened? Malfoy came in. Fleur stopped walking. He did what? He came to see what we had, Harry said. Now he knows we have everything. What did you say to him? Everything he didn't want to hear. Fleur stared at him for a moment, then laughed, not a polite laugh, a real one, quick and genuine, surprised out of her. Mon Dieu, she said. I wish I had been here. Me too, Gabrielle said contentedly. She had attached herself to Harry's left side with the comfortable surety of a person taking possession of something they've already decided is theirs, and she was looking up at him with an expression of complete satisfaction. I knew he would do that. You see, Fleur. I told you he was interesting. You said he was your best friend, Fleur said. That is a different claim. I can make multiple claims, Gabrielle said serenely. They were outside now, Diagon Alley bright and noisy around them, the afternoon sun slanting warm and long across the cobblestones. Harry stopped at the edge of the alley entrance, looking at the street. He needed to get back to the Dursleys. He had maybe 3 hours before Vernon expected him present for dinner, and the consequences of absence would be unpleasant in ways that were currently preventable. 2 weeks, he said, partly to himself. Wizengamot session in 2 weeks. We will be there, Seraphine said behind him. All of us. He turned. The Veela queen stood in the alley entrance with her court, gold-white light in the summer afternoon, amber eyes on him. Fleur beside her, sharp and paying attention. Gabrielle, who had apparently already decided all of this, was settled. There's going to be a fight, Harry said. Not just in the chamber. He'll try something outside it. Yes, Seraphine said. He will. Are you worried? She considered the question with the kind of genuine consideration that meant she wasn't going to give him a comfortable answer. I am concerned, she said. There is a difference. Worried is passive. Concerned means I am already thinking about what to do about it. Harry nodded. He looked at Fleur. You'll be at the session? Wild Abraxans could not prevent me, she said, with complete sincerity. And me, Gabrielle said. You are 9, 7, Gabrielle corrected. 7, Fleur said, closing her eyes briefly. You are 7. You cannot, I will be in the gallery, Gabrielle said, with the tone of someone making a statement of fact about a thing that has already happened. I have decided. Harry looked at her, this 7-year-old who had spent an entire legal proceeding in absolute silence and then announced that he was going to be her best friend with the certainty of someone reading from a finished history. He thought there was something to admire in that. I'll see you both in 2 weeks, he said. He walked up the alley toward the leaky cauldron, hands in the pockets of borrowed jeans, coin warm against his palm. Behind him, he could feel the weight of everything the last 3 days had built, not heavy in a bad way, more the weight of something real and substantial that you'd been carrying in an emptier form for so long you'd forgotten it was supposed to have heft. He had 2 weeks. 2 weeks in the cupboard under the stairs, eating Petunia's leftovers, doing Vernon's chores, listening to Dudley be Dudley. 2 weeks in which Lucius Malfoy would be working with the full resources of a powerful family to construct something designed to make everything Harry now knew feel smaller or less certain or subject to the kind of doubt that systems generate around threats they want to eliminate. He was 8 years old. He was about to walk into the most powerful governing body in the British wizarding world and state a claim in his own name. He felt, turning it over carefully, not afraid of this. He felt, not quite ready, because ready implied there was an end point to the preparation, and he understood already that this wasn't that kind of thing. He felt clear. Clear about what was true and what wasn't, clear about who he was and what had been done, clear about the direction he was pointed in. Clear was enough. He stepped through the leaky cauldron, back into the Muggle Street, and took the bus home. In the morning, he pulled out the only schoolbook the Dursleys let him keep in the cupboard, a battered history of Britain that he'd nicked from the bin when someone on the street had thrown it out, and he opened it to the section on parliamentary procedure. He read it twice, then turned to the section on the history of the House of Lords. Not because it was exactly the same. Because the way power was structured, the way hereditary seats worked, the way claims were made and challenged and defended, some of the logic would translate. And he wanted to understand the logic before he walked into the chamber and used it. He had 12 days. He made a list of everything he needed to know and ranked it by importance and started at the top. Downstairs, Vernon turned the television on. Dudley complained about breakfast portions. Petunia moved through the kitchen with her sharp, economic steps. Harry read, and organized, and thought, and the coin sat warm on the shelf above his cot like a small and steady light. Chapter 4, Parliament of Wolves. The Wizengamot met in a chamber beneath the Ministry of Magic that had been built to intimidate. Harry understood this within 30 seconds of walking in. The ceiling was high enough that the upper galleries vanished into shadow, and the seating was tiered, concentric rings of benches climbing the walls, plum-colored cushions on dark wood, the whole structure designed so that everyone was always looking at everyone else at a slight angle, a geometry of surveillance dressed up as architecture. The floor of the chamber was bare stone, pale gray, and the acoustics had been built so that sound carried everywhere equally, which meant there was nowhere to speak without being heard and nowhere to be heard without having spoken deliberately. It was a room that punished hesitation. Harry walked in beside Seraphine, with Ragnarok on his other side and Goldvault and 2 junior goblins carrying document cases behind them. He was wearing new clothes, not his. Seraphine had arrived at the leaky cauldron this morning with a package and the expression of someone who had made a practical decision and would accept no argument about it, and the clothes inside were dark green and well-fitted and his exact size, which meant she'd measured him somehow without his knowledge, and he filed that away as something to ask her about later, not with irritation but with genuine curiosity about how she'd done it. He walked in and looked at the chamber and did not slow down. The chamber was already half full. Word had spread, clearly, because the session wasn't scheduled for another 30 minutes and the gallery was filling with people who'd come early with the energy of an audience who'd been tipped off that the performance was going to be something unusual. Harry could feel the attention landing on him like sunlight through a lens, focused, warming the edge of burning. He looked at faces without making it obvious he was doing so. The seats were arranged by family or title, plaques affixed at the end of each bench. He saw names he recognized from Ragnarok's documents. Not, 3 rows up on the left. Parkinson, adjacent. Burke, middle tier. And on the right side, in a premier position that spoke to decades of accumulated influence, the Malfoy bench, and Lucius Malfoy already seated, silver blonde hair catching the light, robes impeccable, talking quietly to the man beside him with the easy authority of someone conducting a meeting in a room he considers his own. He didn't look at Harry when Harry entered. That was deliberate, Harry thought. A performance of unconcern. The man beside Malfoy did look, though. Theodore Nott Sr., Harry matched the face to the name from his preparation, and what was in his look was the open assessment of someone who'd received an injunction notice 4 days ago and was not finished processing his feelings about it. Ragnarok steered Harry toward the floor of the chamber, where a small group was waiting, the session chair, a stout witch named Madame Longbottom with the bearing of someone who has been coming to this chamber for decades and has developed opinions about all of it, and 2 ministry officials in the lavender robes of the Law Enforcement Office. Off to one side, watching with the expression Harry was beginning to be able to read from across a room, Dumbledore. "Mr. Potter," Madame Longbottom said. She looked at him with bright, sharp eyes. "Augusta Longbottom, session chair for today's proceeding. I have been briefed on the claims being presented." She paused, and something in her expression moved through several things quickly and landed on something that might have been, in a different person, approval. "You understand that as the presenting claimant in an active investigation, you will be required to formally state your claim in the open chamber before the session can proceed?" "Yes," Harry said. "I understand. And you are prepared to do that yourself? Without a representative?" "Yes." She looked at him for another moment. Then she nodded. "Very well. The session opens in 20 minutes. She glanced past him to Ragnarok. "Director. The documentary evidence will be entered into record prior to proceedings?" "Already filed with the records office this morning," Ragnarok said. "Every member of the chamber was sent a summary copy at dawn." "Efficient," Longbottom said, in a tone that suggested efficiency was something she actively respected. Dumbledore moved toward Harry as Longbottom stepped away. He looked, as he always looked, composed and warm and deeply, subtly alert. He was wearing robes of midnight blue today, and the overall effect was of a man who had dressed for something he expected to be memorable. "Harry," he said. "I'd like a moment, if you'll permit it." Harry looked at Seraphine, not for permission. She understood that because she made no move to intercede, but for the courtesy of acknowledgement. She gave a small nod, the nod of someone saying "I'll be right here." Harry stepped slightly aside with Dumbledore, out of immediate earshot of the others, though not far. He didn't want to be cornered, and he placed himself so he still had sightlines to the room. "I want to tell you," Dumbledore said, and his voice was very low, very direct, without the usual warmth deployed in front of an audience, "that I am not here to obstruct what you're doing today. I want you to know that clearly." "Okay," Harry said. "I also want to, I owe you an accounting," Dumbledore said. "Of my decisions. You were right that there was a will. You were right that I knew Sirius was listed. I believed, at the time, that his guilt was certain, and that acting on a will that named a murderer as guardian would. Did you look for evidence?" Harry asked. "After. When the dust settled. Did you look for evidence that he'd actually had a trial?" A pause. "Long enough." "No," Dumbledore said. "I did not." Harry let that sit. He thought about saying something, but everything he could think of felt either too large for a conversation 3 minutes before a Wisengamot session or too small for what the admission actually contained. He settled on, I know you thought you were doing right." "I did," Dumbledore said. "I still believe the instinct was protective. But I am beginning to understand that protective instincts that operate without accountability produce." He stopped. Started again. "You deserved better. Whatever my reasoning, you deserved better." It was the second plain admission, and again, Harry didn't know what to do with something that was too honest to argue with. "After this is done," he said, "I'd like to talk properly. About my parents. About the things you know that I don't." "I would be glad of that conversation," Dumbledore said. "Any time you want it." "You'll find I have opinions," Harry said. "About some of your choices." "I'd expect nothing less," Dumbledore said, and the warmth in his eyes was genuine, and something else was in there too, the quiet, complicated thing of a man who looked at an 8-year-old and saw what should have been there from the beginning and wasn't, and had to sit with being part of the reason why. "Good luck today, Harry. Though I don't think you need it." He moved away toward the upper benches. Harry watched him go and thought that Dumbledore was possibly the most complicated person he'd ever encountered, which was saying something given that he'd also encountered Lucius Malfoy. The chamber filled. The upper gallery filled faster, spectators with no voting rights but every intention of watching. Harry caught movement in the high gallery and looked up to find Fleur's silver blonde hair, and beside her, inexplicably, Gabrielle, who had apparently made good on her stated intention and was sitting in the gallery with the expression of someone who had accomplished a minor logistical victory and was now prepared to enjoy the proceeds. Fleur caught his eye across the distance and gave him a look that said, very clearly, "I tried to stop her." Harry almost smiled. Madame Longbottom called the chamber to order at 10 o'clock precisely, her voice carrying to every corner with the ease of someone who has been doing this for decades. The murmur of the chamber compressed itself and went quiet, and the quality of the quiet was charged. This emergency plenary session has been called to hear the challenge filed by Lucius Abraxas Malfoy against the investigative injunction issued by Gringotts Bank on behalf of Harry James Potter, she said. In accordance with procedure, the claimant will first state their claim. Mr. Potter. Harry stood up from the floor-level bench where he'd been seated and walked to the center of the stone floor. He was aware, acutely, of the size disparity, the high-ceilinged chamber, the tiered ranks of adult witches and wizards, the plum robes and the plaques, and the weight of institutional permanence that this room had been accumulating for centuries. He was also wearing clothes that fit for the first time in his life, and he had 27 documented claims and 400 years of a Veela queen's foresight behind him, and he did not feel small. He looked at the chamber. Not at Malfoy specifically, not at any one face, at the chamber as a whole, the way he'd watched Seraphine look at a crowd in Diagon Alley, with the even attention of someone who has nothing to prove and everything to say. "My name is Harry James Potter," he said. His voice carried, the acoustics helped, but the carrying was his own. "I am the sole heir of the House of Potter and its connected family lines. On the 14th of July this year, a heritage verification test conducted at Gringotts Bank confirmed that 27 hereditary lordship seats belonging to my family by blood right are currently held by other parties through means that Gringotts has documented as fraudulent." He paused, one beat. "Those seats include voting rights in this chamber that have been exercised, without legitimate authority, for as long as 50 years. I am here to formally assert my claim to all 27, to support the Gringotts injunction freezing their use, and to request that this chamber acknowledge the documentation submitted by Director Ragnarok and proceed to full adjudication." Silence. Then the noise, not chaos, controlled but significant, the specific sound of a large group of people absorbing something and beginning to have reactions to it that they were suppressing with varying degrees of success. "Thank you, Mr. Potter," Longbottom said. "Be seated. The chamber will hear the challenge." Lucius Malfoy rose. And here it was, the thing Harry had been watching for since the moment Malfoy had walked into Gringotts 3 days ago. Because Malfoy in a public chamber was different from Malfoy in a private room. He moved differently, stood differently, occupied the space with the specific ease of someone who understood that this stage was where he performed best, that the rules of the Wizengamot were rules he'd been playing by and shaping and quietly rewriting for years, and that his advantage here was not just preparation but fluency. He was fluent in this room. He was reading it in real time, adjusting, performing. "Madam Longbottom," Malfoy said, his voice carrying with the practiced resonance of a decade of public speaking. "Members of this chamber. I want to begin by acknowledging that the question of Harry Potter's heritage is, of course, a matter of genuine importance. The boy deserves to know his family history. No one in this chamber would argue otherwise." He let the reasonableness of that settle. "What I challenge is not the legitimacy of Mr. Potter's inquiry, but the manner in which Gringotts has inserted itself into what is fundamentally a matter of Wizengamot governance." He was good. Harry could see it from the floor, could see heads nodding slightly in the upper tiers, not committed nods but the involuntary nods of people who are being told something that sounds reasonable and are responding to the sound of reasonableness before they've examined what it's actually saying. "Gringotts has the authority to manage individual estates," Malfoy continued. "What it does not have is the authority to unilaterally freeze the voting rights of seated members of this chamber based on the findings of an internal investigation that no independent body has verified." He looked at Ragnarok, seated at the floor-level bench, with the expression of someone making a point rather than attacking. "We respect the work of Gringotts. We rely on it. But the independence of this chamber from any single institution, including our fine banking partners, is a principle that has been foundational to magical governance for 600 years. He sat down. There was a murmur of what Harry categorized as genuine agreement from perhaps a third of the chamber. He looked at them, the people nodding, the faces aligned with the argument, and thought about the argument's actual structure. Malfoy hadn't touched the evidence. Hadn't contested a single document. Had built an entirely separate argument on a principle that was both real and entirely irrelevant to whether the documents were fraudulent. It was, Harry thought, quite clever. Ragnarok stood. He didn't do it with Malfoy's performance, he just stood up, flat and direct, with the quality of something that has weight and knows it. "Mr. Malfoy has correctly identified the principle of chamber independence," Ragnarok said. "He has applied it incorrectly. Gringotts' authority to freeze assets under investigation is not derived from governance jurisdiction, it is derived from contract law. Every holder of a Gringotts registered seat signed, upon registration, a standard agreement acknowledging Gringotts' right to freeze contested holdings pending investigation. Mr. Malfoy signed this agreement in 1981, when he inherited the Malfoy holdings." Ragnarok looked at Malfoy steadily. "He signed it again in 1985 when he added a secondary registration for the Burke seat." A longer silence. "The jurisdictional argument," Ragnarok continued, "is therefore without merit. The injunction is derived from a contract Mr. Malfoy himself signed. The only question before this chamber is whether the documented evidence of fraud is sufficient to warrant proceeding to full adjudication." He looked at the chamber. "I believe the evidence speaks to that question adequately. But I invite the chamber to review it." He sat down. Harry watched Malfoy. The performance composure was intact but the eyes were calculating faster, running through whatever the next move was. It came from an unexpected direction. A witch in the upper tiers, middle-aged, with the bearing of someone who spent time in public life and moved through it with ease, Dolores Umbridge, Harry would later learn her name, senior undersecretary to the minister, stood with a small, sweet smile. "Madam Longbottom," she said, in a voice like pink ribbon wrapped around something hard. "Before we proceed to review of evidence, I wonder if the chamber might address a preliminary matter. The presenting claimant is a child of 8 years. While we all sympathize with his situation, deeply, one must ask whether it is in his best interests to be here at all, presenting his own claim without a legal guardian or ministry-appointed representative. Surely proper procedure would suggest, Mr. Potter has a legal representative," Ragnarok said, without standing. "Queen Seraphine Delacour of the Veela courts, who is present." He paused. Additionally, Mr. Potter is the holder of the contested seats. His presence is not a procedural anomaly. It is, under Wisengamot Rule 47, his right. Of course, Umbridge said, sweetly, the smile unchanged. We merely wish to ensure the child isn't being overwhelmed or directed by parties whose interests may not align precisely with his own welfare. Harry stood up. He didn't ask permission. The rules he'd read said that the presenting claimant could speak in response to procedural challenges, and this was a procedural challenge. I'm not overwhelmed, he said, looking at Umbridge directly. And I'm not being directed. The people who are here with me told me exactly what I was walking into and asked me, twice, if I wanted to proceed. I did and I do. He looked at her steadily. My interests are my own, and my interests are that 27 seats which belong to my family are returned to my family, and that the people who've been using them without the right to do so are held accountable for it. Those are my interests. I don't need anyone to have told me what they are. The sweet smile on Umbridge's face didn't disappear, but something behind it flickered and went somewhere else. Longbottom, who had been watching Harry with the expression of someone updating a running assessment, allowed herself one small, controlled nod that meant nothing officially and everything practically. The chamber will proceed to evidence review, she said. Director Ragnarok, please present. What followed was 3 hours. Ragnarok presented with the systematic precision of someone who had built an argument the way you build a structure, foundation first, then walls, then roof, everything load-bearing and nothing decorative. The forged blood adoption papers first, with a side-by-side comparison of the false authentication signature and the authentic signature of the same official from the public Wisengamot record. Then the compelled contracts, with the coercion clauses highlighted and the magical analysis of the compulsion charms embedded in the original document parchment. Then the Veela sovereignty document with the dead woman's signature. Seraphine took the floor for the sovereignty section, and her manner of presenting was entirely different from Ragnarok's. It was not less precise, but it operated on a different register. The weight of it carried not in technical analysis but in the plain fact of what she was, the reigning Veela queen, speaking before the chamber about documents that had used the fraudulent consent of her court to commit a crime against her court's sovereign rights. The chamber was very quiet for this section. 3 times, members of the families under investigation attempted procedural interruptions. All 3 were denied by Longbottom with the crisp efficiency of someone who had anticipated the attempts and already had rulings prepared. The not counterclaim was addressed directly. Ragnarok produced the side-by-side document analysis with the efficiency of someone pulling a sword, and the chamber could see, very clearly, that the authentication on the not purchase was the same false signature as the Malfoy blood adoption paper. Same hand, different date. The chamber's murmur at this was different from the earlier ones, sharper, with an edge. By the time Ragnarok finished, the quality of the chamber had changed. The initial third that had been nodding along with Malfoy's reasonableness argument had contracted. Some of those faces were now doing the controlled blankness of people who do not want their reactions read. Others, the ones not directly implicated, the ones who had been quietly voting alongside the fraudulent seats for decades without knowing what they were voting alongside, were doing something different. Something that combined anger and discomfort in the specific ratio of people who have discovered they were used. Longbottom called for responses. Malfoy rose again. He spoke for 8 minutes, and he was impressive. He pivoted from the jurisdictional argument to a documentation challenge, raising questions about chain of custody and interpretation that were technically defensible and completely irrelevant to the core evidence but created enough procedural noise to give his allies something to hold on to. Harry watched the faces of those allies, Knott, Parkinson, Burke, and watched them calibrate to the noise, settling on it like a ledge. Ragnarok demolished the documentation challenge in 4 minutes and 2 sentences. Then Longbottom asked whether anyone in the chamber wished to speak in support of the presenting claimant's case. Augusta Longbottom, Harry noted, was asking if anyone wanted to speak for him. The phrasing was deliberate. She was giving the chamber a choice that was also a position, and the quality of who responded and how quickly they responded would be itself a piece of information. 3 witches and wizards stood within 10 seconds. Harry didn't know all their names, but he recognized one face, Amelia Bones, director of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement, whose family held one of the 27 seats through what Ragnarok's investigation had called the complicated involuntary case. She was there partly, Harry suspected, because her family's seat was on the list and she needed to manage that, but also because she was the head of law enforcement and documented fraud in the Wisengamot's own seat registry was, straightforwardly, her department's problem. She spoke for 6 minutes and the tone of what she said was the flat, prosecutorial register of someone who had reviewed the evidence and arrived at a conclusion. The documentation submitted by Gringotts constitutes, by any standard of magical contract law, sufficient grounds for immediate adjudication, she said. The question before this chamber is not whether fraud occurred, the evidence is clear. The question is whether this body will treat the fraud as the crime it is or attempt to manage it as an inconvenience. She looked at the chamber, and the look was very direct. I recommend adjudication proceed immediately and in full. When she sat down, the chamber had a different texture again. The noise was building somewhere beneath the surface, not released yet but present, the subterranean sound of a thing moving toward a decision. The vote on whether to proceed to full adjudication was called. Harry watched the hands go up. The process was clear: for, against, abstain. He counted as they appeared. The for votes came in fast, more than he'd expected, and the against votes were fewer than Malfoy had presumably hoped for, and the abstentions were telling in their own way, several of the implicated families abstaining rather than voting against, which was the move of people who knew they were on the wrong side of documented evidence and didn't want to compound it. The final count was announced by Longbottom: 63 in favor of proceeding, 22 against, 9 abstentions. The injunction was formally confirmed. The adjudication would proceed. A full hearing was scheduled for 6 weeks' time. The chamber erupted, not physically, the decorum held, but the controlled noise of it went up by several registers, conversations breaking out, robes rustling, people leaning toward each other with urgent murmurs. Harry sat in the floor-level bench and watched it happen around him and felt, with some surprise, not triumph exactly but the satisfaction of something built correctly holding its weight. Then, across the chamber, he watched Lucius Malfoy stand and say something to the man beside him, who nodded once, and then looked directly at Harry, across the stone floor, across the distance, with an expression that had entirely abandoned the performance of unconcern from earlier. It was not angry. It was not, to Harry's careful read, rattled. It was the expression of a man who had walked into a battle, assessed the enemy's capabilities more fully than he'd had the opportunity to assess them before, and was now walking out to recalculate. Malfoy gave Harry a single, precise nod. Then he turned and walked out through the upper exit, cane in hand, not hurrying. Harry watched him go. A hand landed on his shoulder, Ragnarok's, brief and formal. Adjudication in 6 weeks, the director said. Today was the first engagement. He will be considerably more prepared for the second. I know, Harry said. So will I. Ragnarok made the sound adjacent to satisfaction and went to collect his documents. Seraphine sat down beside Harry on the bench. Around them the chamber was still alive with noise and movement. She didn't say anything for a moment, just sat, watching the room, and the watching had the quality of someone reviewing a completed thing before moving on to the next. You did well, she said. Finally. The evidence did the work, Harry said. The evidence is a tool, she said. You walked into that room and you didn't flinch. You spoke to this chamber the way you'd speak to anyone, like the truth of what you were saying was its own authority. She paused. That is not a common quality at any age. Harry looked at the chamber. The benches, the plum cushions, the carved stone galleries. He thought about his parents' will, the stag seal in old wax, be exactly yourself. He thought about 27 gold lines and a silver one that went 400 years in the wrong direction, if wrong was even the right word for something that had been waiting. "Someone's going to try to hurt me before the next session," he said. Not with fear. Just stating the shape of what was coming. Malfoy won't wait 6 weeks and let the adjudication play out. He'll try to change the board. Seraphine was quiet for a beat. "Yes," she said. "I believe so. Are we ready for that?" She turned and looked at him, amber eyes direct and entirely honest. "We are considerably better prepared than we were 3 hours ago," she said. "The injunction is confirmed. You have 63 members of this chamber on record supporting adjudication. You have Ragnarok and the full legal machinery of Gringotts. You have the Veela court's formal involvement." She paused. "And you have something else, Harry. Something that Lucius Malfoy looked at today and could not quite account for." "What's that?" "Yourself," she said simply. Behind them, the chamber door opened, and Harry looked up to find Fleur descending from the gallery stairs, Gabrielle 3 steps ahead of her as always, already crossing the chamber floor with the purposeful energy of someone who has waited long enough. "You were magnificent," Gabrielle announced, arriving at Harry's side and apparently considering this a perfectly normal thing to say to someone at full volume in the middle of the Wizengamot chamber. "I spoke for about 2 minutes total," Harry said. "Oui," Gabrielle said. "Magnificently." She sat down beside him with the surety of someone claiming a seat they've reserved. Fleur arrived, somewhat more decorously, and looked at Harry with the focused attention he was learning was her version of warmth, direct and assessing and entirely genuine because it didn't bother to perform as anything else. "The moment with Umbridge," she said. "That was the best part." "She wasn't wrong that I'm 8, Harry said. "She was trying to make you feel like 8 was a disqualification," Fleur said. "You made it irrelevant." She tilted her head slightly. "How did you know to stand upright then?" "Because she was trying to make the question about me instead of about the evidence," Harry said. "And the only person who could correct that was me." Fleur looked at him for a moment. "You think quickly." "I had 12 days to prepare." "Most people would have spent 12 days being nervous," she said. "I was also nervous," Harry said. "I'm just better at reading than I am at being nervous." Fleur almost smiled, the same as that first almost, quick and genuine and gone before it fully arrived. "You should come to France," she said, as if this was a natural next step in the conversation. "Before the adjudication session. Grandmere has been, there are things about the Veela court and your bloodline that she can explain better there than anywhere else." "Will there be room?" Harry asked. "There is always room," Gabrielle said, with authority, as if the concept of space being insufficient was one she found philosophically baffling. Harry looked at Seraphine, who had been listening to this exchange with the expression of someone watching something develop according to a plan they'd had from the beginning and were now watching confirm itself in real time. "I believe Director Ragnarok would agree," she said, "that visiting the Veela court prior to the adjudication would be legally relevant. Given the nature of the blood bond claims." "It would be legally relevant," Ragnarok said, appearing at Harry's shoulder with his documents tucked under one arm. He'd apparently been close enough to hear the last exchange. "And practically advisable." He looked at Harry. "There are aspects of the Veela bond element of your claim that we have not yet fully documented. Understanding the nature of those bonds, from the source, will strengthen the adjudication case." A pause. "Considerably." Harry thought about France. He thought about the Dursleys, and the cupboard, and the 12 days he'd just spent doing the only preparation he could in the space he'd been given. He thought about Malfoy walking out of this chamber with the expression of someone recalculating, and about what recalculating looked like in practice for someone with that kind of resources. "Ragnarok," he said. "The investigation into Sirius Black's imprisonment, is there any update?" "The DMLE responded this morning," Ragnarok said. "They have acknowledged the filing and assigned an investigator." He paused, and the pause carried freight. "The investigator is Amelia Bones. The same one who just spoke for adjudication." Yes. Harry was quiet for a moment. Outside the chamber, the corridor beyond the doors was audible, voices, footsteps, the Ministry's ambient institutional noise. Somewhere in Azkaban, in a cell that should never have been his, a man who was supposed to have raised him was spending his 1200 and whatever consecutive day paying for something a court had never proven he did. "How fast can bones move?" he asked. "Faster than most," Ragnox said. "Especially now that she has spoken publicly on record in a session that contained her own family's involvement in the broader investigation. She is motivated to demonstrate independence." Another pause. "And she is, by personal inclination, someone who finds the existence of a 7-year imprisonment without trial offensive." "Good," Harry said. He stood up from the bench. The chamber was still buzzing around him, members in conversation, Ministry officials moving through with the energy of people whose afternoon had been disrupted. He looked at the room one last time, the tiered benches, the names on the plaques, the contested seats with their plaques still bearing the wrong names. 6 weeks. They would still bear the wrong names for 6 weeks. And then. "France," he said to Seraphine. "How soon can we go? How soon would you like to?" He thought about the Dursleys. He thought about Seraphine's token, warm on his palm. He thought about Ragnox filing his secondary investigation into the management of the Potter estate, into living conditions. "Is there a legal mechanism," he said, carefully, "for my guardian's situation to be resolved before France? Officially, I mean. Not Dumbledore, I know that was never legal. But some formal arrangement?" Seraphine looked at him. The amber eyes were very steady. "Yes," she said. "Under Veela sovereignty law, while a blood bond claim is active and under investigation, the Veela Queen can petition for temporary custodial oversight of the bonded individual. It is used very rarely." She paused. "I would exercise it." "Then exercise it," Harry said. He said it simply, without drama, the way he said everything, like it was the next accurate thing in a sequence of accurate things. "Please." Seraphine looked at him for a long moment, and the expression on her face was something Harry didn't quite have the vocabulary for yet. It was the expression of a very powerful woman who had spent a long time being capable of protecting things and was finally, for the first time in a specific context, being asked to. "Gold vault," she said. The legal goblin appeared at her elbow as if he'd been waiting for his name. "Your Majesty. Draft the custodial petition. Expedited. I want it filed before end of day." "Yes, Your Majesty." Harry looked at Ragnox. Ragnox looked back with the expression of a goblin who had seen a great many things in a great many years of directing the most powerful financial institution in the wizarding world and was filing this particular day in a specific, notable category. "You realize," Ragnox said, very quietly, only to Harry, "that what you began in July with a heritage test has become, in roughly 3 weeks, one of the most significant legal and political proceedings in British wizarding history." "I know," Harry said. "And you are 8 years old." "I know that too." Ragnox was quiet for a beat. "Your parents," he said, and it was the first time he'd mentioned them directly, "had an account with this bank for 14 years before their deaths. I reviewed their transaction history as part of the investigation." He paused, and something in the Gravelan brass voice shifted almost imperceptibly. "They were people worth knowing. I am sorry that you did not get to." Harry stood with that for a moment. He was still not going to cry in Gringotts. But it was closer than it had been before, and the closeness felt like something important, like the right kind of pressure on the right kind of material. "Thank you," he said. He walked out of the Wizengamot chamber with Seraphine on one side and Fleur on the other and Gabrielle slightly ahead as always, already planning something, her small purposeful figure cutting through the ministry corridor with an 8-year-old's absolute certainty that the world was arranged for her convenience. Harry let himself be swept along in it for a moment, the noise of the ministry, the bustle of the corridor, the living present-tense world that was already responding to what had happened in that chamber today. He thought about Lucius Malfoy recalculating. He thought about Sirius Black in Azkaban. He thought about a will with a stag seal and 2 handwritings side by side. He thought about France, and what Seraphine had said she could explain better there. The 28th seat, Isadora's creation, the silver line that went inward. He hadn't forgotten it. He'd been patient with it, because you could only hold so many things at once, and the 27 had needed his full attention first. But now the 27 were in motion. The machinery was running. Time, Harry thought, to find out what the silver line meant. Chapter 5, Old Magic, Older Debts. The Delacour estate sat in the hills above Bordeaux like it had grown there, which in some meaningful sense it had. The main house was old enough that the distinction between the building and the landscape had blurred, stone walls draped in climbing roses that had been there longer than anyone currently living, terraced gardens that stepped down toward the valley in long green stages, and the whole thing wrapped in the particular quality of stillness that belongs to places where magic has been practiced continuously for centuries, a stillness that wasn't absence of sound but presence of something else, deeper and more fundamental. Harry stood on the upper terrace on his first morning and looked at it and felt something he didn't immediately have a name for. Not homesickness, he'd never had a home to be sick for. Not quite belonging either. Something between the two. The specific sensation of a place that fits in the way that very few places fit, like a key in a lock that you've been carrying without knowing you had it. He'd been here 4 days. The custodial petition had gone through in 48 hours, Goldvault had been as good as Seraphine's word, and the Wisengamot Records Office, presented with a petition from the Veela Queen herself under active sovereignty law, had processed it with the efficiency of people who understood that the alternative was a diplomatic incident. Dumbledore had been notified. He had raised no objection, which Harry thought was itself a kind of statement, the acknowledgement of a man who had done what he believed was necessary and was now, carefully, stepping back. The Dursleys had received an official ministry notification. Vernon had read it twice with the expression of a man trying to find the angle from which it became someone else's problem. Then he'd gone back to the television. Petunia had said nothing. Dudley had asked if he could have Harry's cupboard for his football cards. Harry had packed. It hadn't taken long. Now he was here, on a terrace in the Bordeaux Hills, for days into what was simultaneously a legal preparation visit and something more complicated, watching the valley catch the morning light and trying to sort out which parts of what he was feeling were relevant to the case and which parts were simply what it felt like to be somewhere that didn't make you smaller by existing in it. You wake up early. He turned. Fleur was leaning in the terrace doorway in a robe over her pajamas, her silver blonde hair unbraided and loose, holding a cup of something that steamed in the morning air. She looked younger than she did when she was assembled for the world, not worse, just more actual. I always do, Harry said. Old habit. She came and stood beside him, looking at the valley. The light is best now, she said. In 2 hours it will be too bright. She sipped her drink. How are you sleeping? Better than I have in, he stopped. Thought about the honest answer. Better than I can remember. Fleur looked at him sideways, brief and assessing. Then she looked back at the valley. The estate has old magic in it, she said. Very old. It settles into you if you stay long enough. Grandmere says that is why she chose it, that the land itself remembers what the Veela court is, and the remembering has a quality that protects. How old is old? Older than the house. Older than the family's time here. She paused. Grandmere would say the land chose the family as much as the family chose it. A slight tilt of her head. I used to think that was a romantic story. I am less certain now. Harry thought about this. He thought about a heritage test that had drawn gold lines on parchment, about blood that remembered things its owner hadn't been told, about a seat created 400 years ago with a name in it. The land chose the family. The magic found what it was looking for. The same logic, the same kind of old, deliberate intention operating through materials that humans thought of as passive: earth, blood, time. Does it bother you? Fleur asked. That you didn't know any of this before? It did, Harry said. In the first week, he paused, choosing the honest version instead of the functional one. It was very large and very angry, and I had nowhere to put it while I was still living with the Dursleys. So I put it in a drawer and did the work that needed doing. He looked at the valley. I think when this is over and everything's settled, I'm going to open the drawer and it's going to be a lot. That seems, Fleur said carefully, like a reasonable but not entirely healthy approach. Probably not, Harry agreed. But it was what I had. Fleur was quiet for a moment. Harry had learned in 4 days, a specific quality of silence, not uncomfortable, not performing thoughtfulness, just actually thinking and not feeling the need to fill the space while she did it. He appreciated this more than he knew how to say. When this is over, she said, you should come back. Not for legal reasons. A pause, and something in it had the quality of someone saying something they've decided to say rather than something that just came out. This place is good for opening drawers. I have found that myself. Harry looked at her. What's in yours? She met his eyes, direct as always. Being the granddaughter of the Veela Queen is its own kind of pressure. There are expectations about what I should be, how I should use what I am, what it means to be part Veela in a world that mostly looks at you and sees only the part that's useful to them. A slight lift of her chin. I find it instructive to spend time with someone who has been handed more legacy than he asked for and handles it by reading everything in sight and refusing to be intimidated. Is that what I do? It is very obviously what you do, she said, and the almost smile was there again, closer this time to actually arriving. Behind them, Gabrielle's voice floated through the open doorway. If you are both awake and nobody woke me up, I am extremely offended. Fleur closed her eyes for precisely 3 seconds. She has the hearing of a creature that should not exist, she said. I heard that, Gabrielle said. Harry laughed, actually laughed, the way he almost never did, surprised out of him. Fleur turned and walked back toward the house with the dignity of someone pretending they hadn't heard either of them, and the morning opened up around the terrace, warm and real and his. Seraphine met with him in the afternoons. She had a room she called her study, though library would have been more accurate, floor-to-ceiling shelves of books and scrolls, a desk that was clear of everything except whatever she was currently working on, and the specific quality of someone who thought for a living and had arranged their environment to accommodate that. She made tea in an old earthenware pot and poured it without asking if he wanted any, which he found he appreciated. The first 3 sessions had covered history, the Veela courts, their structure, their legal standing under the Accords of Avalon, the specific nature of blood bond seats and what the bonds actually meant in magical terms. Harry had taken notes. Seraphine had watched him take notes with an expression he was beginning to read as her version of warmth, which was not demonstrative but was entirely real. On the 4th day, she set aside the documents and looked at him across the tea tray with the amber eyes that were always paying attention to something slightly beyond the surface of things. Today, she said, I want to talk about the silver line. Harry set down his quill. Tell me. She poured tea for both of them, and the pouring had the quality of someone organizing their thoughts into the shape of what they were about to say. Isadora Veracruz was born in 1598, she began. She became queen of the Veela courts of southern Europe at the age of 24 and held that position for 61 years. She is remembered for 3 things. She held up 3 fingers, ticking them off. The reformation of the Veela blood bond law that prevented the bonds from being used as collateral in human financial transactions. The establishment of the court archive. And the seat of the returned. The silver line. Yes. In 1641, Isadora convened a full court session, every regional court, which hadn't happened in living memory at the time, and announced that she had seen something. Not a prophecy in the formal sense. A thread-sight vision. Seraphine set down her cup. She said she had seen the shape of a debt. Not a personal debt, a structural one. A wrong that would be built slowly, over generations, into the body of magical society itself. A systematic theft of power from those who held ancient bonds with the Veela courts, and the consequence of that theft rippling forward through time until it became, as she described it, a weight that the whole structure would eventually collapse under. Harry said nothing, listening. She said she had also seen the person who would address it, Seraphine continued. Not fix it, she was very specific about this word, address. She didn't see a hero who would vanquish evil. She saw a mechanism. Someone through whom the accumulated wrong would be processed and discharged. Someone who would arrive, she said, without knowing what they were, and would find out, and would not flinch, and would do the work. She looked at Harry across the tea tray. She described the person in very specific terms. The blood would carry ancient Veela bonds wound around a core of something she called anchored fire, a magical signature she said she'd never encountered before in her thread sight but that she would know if she felt it again. And you felt it, Harry said. In Diagon Alley. The moment I came within 40 feet of you, Seraphine said. I have described blood sense to people before as a sound, a resonance that certain magical bloodlines produce when they're in proximity to something they're connected to. What I felt from you was not a sound. It was, do you know what it sounds like when a bell has been rung once, very hard, in a very large empty room, and the sound has been vibrating for a very long time but it hasn't died yet? She paused. It was that. 400 years of vibration, still alive. Harry sat with this for a moment. He turned his teacup in his hands, feeling the warmth of it, and thought about Isadora in 1641 seeing a thread and following it forward through time to a child who hadn't been born yet, writing a name into a seal that wasn't a name as names go but a magical signature, and then dying, eventually, and trusting that the seal would hold until the signature arrived. What does the seat do? He asked. The 28th one. Not what it represents, what does it do? Seraphine was quiet for a moment. That, she said, is what I wanted to tell you today. She stood and went to one of the shelves, pulling a scroll, old, very old, the parchment preserved in the way that important Veela documents were preserved, with a layer of magic over the physical material that kept it in perfect condition regardless of time. She brought it to the table and unrolled it carefully. The writing was in the Veela court runic script, the same script that had appeared on Harry's heritage test parchment, and it was dense and detailed and Harry couldn't read a word of it. But the diagrams were visible, and they were extraordinary. Not decorative. Functional diagrams, the kind you found in technical documents, showing flows and connections and something that looked like a resonance map, circles within circles with lines running between them at precise angles. The seat of the returned, Seraphine said, tracing the diagram with one finger, not touching the parchment, is not a governance seat in the usual sense. It carries no Wisengamot voting rights. It has no attached vault or land holdings. She looked at Harry. What it carries is an activation right. Activation of what? Every blood bond the Veela courts have ever made, she said. Every agreement, every promise, every ancient contract between Veela court magic and a human family, they are all, in some sense, still alive. Some dormant. Some active. Some stolen, as we've seen. She looked at the diagram. Isadora's seat is the right to call all of them to attention at once. To stand before the whole network of blood bonds and say, these are the terms, and it is time to account for them. The room was very quiet. That's, Harry started. Stopped. That's enormous. Yes, Seraphine said, without drama. It would affect every family with a blood bond claim. Not just the 27. Every family in Britain with any Veela connection whatsoever, Seraphine confirmed. And there are more than you would expect. Veela bonds were common in certain centuries, among certain families, as marks of alliance. Most are dormant. Many the families themselves have forgotten. A pause. But the records are in the court archive. They exist. Harry looked at the diagram. At the circles within circles, the radiating lines. He thought about what this meant, not just for his case, not just for the adjudication session, but for the larger structure of things. The systematic theft that Isadora had seen in her thread site had been built over 40 years, possibly more. It had been built inside the institutions that were supposed to prevent it, using the tools of those institutions, by people who understood those tools deeply enough to misuse them without being caught. You couldn't fix that with a court case. You could address 27 seats in a court case. But the network, the underlying pattern, the way power had been quietly accumulated and pointed in a specific direction, that needed something that operated at the same level as the thing it was addressing. She knew, Harry said slowly. Isadora. She saw that a court case wouldn't be enough. That's why the seat does what it does. Seraphine looked at him, and the amber eyes were doing the deep end of the lake thing again, the sense of more beneath the surface. Yes, she said. So the 27 seats are, the immediate wrong. Yes. The adjudication will address them. But the seat she created, she stopped, then chose her words carefully. Isadora believed that the activation of that seat would be the mechanism by which the full network of stolen and corrupted bonds was exposed and corrected. Not by you alone. By the magic itself, recognizing its rightful holder and conducting itself accordingly. Another pause. She wrote that the holder of the seat would not need to do anything except be what they are. The magic would do the rest. What does that mean in practical terms? Harry asked. I don't know, Seraphine said, and the honesty in it was refreshing in the specific way that honesty from someone who usually knows things is refreshing. No one has held that seat in 400 years. We have the theory. The diagram. She gestured at the scroll. What the activation actually looks like, what it feels like, I cannot tell you. I have prepared you as much as I can. She met his eyes directly. What I can tell you is that when you walked into Gringotts on that first day and looked at the heritage test parchment without flinching, I thought, yes. This is what she described. The one who would do the work without needing to be told they could. Harry looked at the scroll for a long moment. Then he looked up. When does it activate? When you formally accept the seat, Seraphine said. We had planned to do this at the adjudication session, as part of the formal reclamation. But, she paused. Harry waited. She reached across the table and picked up a small piece of parchment that had been underneath the scroll, folded twice, with a Gringotts seal on the outside. This arrived this morning, she said, and handed it to him. He unfolded it. Ragnar's handwriting, precise and economical, every word load-bearing. Mr. Potter. 3 matters requiring your immediate awareness. 1. Lucius Malfoy has filed an emergency injunction of his own, challenging the custodial petition on the grounds that it was filed without ministry consultation. The filing is legally weak but designed to delay. I am responding. 2. 2 days ago, an individual attempted to access the Potter primary vault using a forged blood authentication key. The attempt was detected and the individual has been taken into Gringotts custody. The key was crafted by someone with sophisticated knowledge of Gringotts security protocols. Investigation ongoing. 3. Sirius Black escaped Azkaban last night. Amelia Bones' investigation into his trial record reached a stage yesterday at which his continued imprisonment became legally indefensible. Bones issued a provisional release order. He is currently under DMLE supervision. He knows about you. He is asking to see you. Come soon. Harry set the note down on the table. He read it again. The vault break-in. Malfoy's injunction. Sirius Black, out of Azkaban and asking for him. He looked at Seraphine, who had clearly already read the note and was watching him process it with the steady patience of someone who has given a person news and is giving them the space to respond to it honestly. He's out, Harry said. Yes. Is he stopped. Started again. Is he all right? Ragnar's note doesn't specify his condition, Seraphine said carefully. Azkaban takes a toll. 7 years without trial, she paused. He will need care and time. But he is alive and free and, Ragnar says, asking for you. Harry sat with this. Sirius Black, the name on the will, the guardian who'd never gotten to be one, the person his father had loved enough to name as primary caretaker of his son. A stranger, technically. A stranger who had spent 7 years in the worst prison in the wizarding world for something he hadn't done, while Harry was in a cupboard under the stairs, and both of them had been waiting without knowing they were waiting for the same thing to change. I need to go back, Harry said. Yes, Seraphine agreed. The vault break-in, is Malfoy, Harry said. He wasn't guessing. He was reading the sequence, the failed jurisdictional challenge, the recalculation after the Wizengamot session, the 2 weeks since that session. He doesn't want the adjudication to reach the vault records. There's something in the vault. What would be in the vault? Seraphine asked, and it wasn't a test exactly, more the question of someone thinking alongside him. The will was in the secondary vault, Harry said. But the primary vault, my parents' main vault, would have the full family records. Property documents. Original copies of things. He thought about the forged blood adoption papers, the false authentication signatures. If there are original documents in the Potter vault that directly contradict the fraudulent versions in the Wizengamot registry, then the forgeries become provable as forgeries beyond any procedural doubt, Seraphine finished. Yes. That would explain the timing. Harry stood. He was already thinking about packing, about the timeline, about what Ragnar would need from him when he arrived. Then he stopped, because the scroll was still on the table, the diagram of circles within circles, and something had been sitting in the back of his thinking since Seraphine had explained the activation and he'd let it sit there while he processed the rest of it. Seraphine, he said. The activation of the seat. You said I need to formally accept it. Yes. Before the adjudication session. She looked at him, steady and patient. That would be my recommendation. Then let's do it now, he said. Before we go back. Before Malfoy's next move, before the vault investigation, before the adjudication. He held her gaze. If the magic does what Isadora said it would do, I want it active before we walk into that session. I want everything that needs to be seen to be visible. Seraphine was still for a moment. Then she stood, and her bearing shifted in the way it had shifted in Diagon Alley when she'd made the decision to approach him, the Veela Queen coming fully present, authority settling into her like a second skeleton. Then we do it now, she said. The ritual was held in the garden, because Seraphine said the old magic needed open sky. It was evening by then, the light low and honey golden over the valley, the air warm and carrying the smell of the climbing roses from the estate walls. The Veela court had assembled, all 12 of Seraphine's companions arranged in a loose ring, not ceremonially stiff but present and attending, their gold-white light mixing with the evening gold of the sky. Fleur was there, standing slightly behind Seraphine. Gabrielle was beside her, and for once entirely silent, not because she'd been told to be, Harry suspected, but because she understood, in the 7-year-old way that was somehow more accurate than adult understanding sometimes, that this was the kind of moment that didn't need commentary. Seraphine stood facing Harry in the center of the ring. She held the scroll, though she didn't appear to be reading from it. She'd had 400 years of court knowledge in her head and she moved through the words with the ease of someone returning to a language they've always known. The seat of the returned was created by Isidora Veracruz, Queen of the Veela courts of Southern Europe, in the year 1641, Seraphine said. Her voice was carrying differently now, not louder, but further, with a resonance that Harry associated with the quality of very old magic, the kind that had been doing something long enough to have become efficient at it. It was created to hold a promise. Not a promise made by a person. A promise made by the magic itself, that what had been stolen would one day be returned, and that the one who returned it would have the court's full acknowledgement and standing. She looked at Harry. "Are you Harry James Potter, bloodholder of the seats in question and bearer of the signature Isadora recorded in this seal?" "Yes," Harry said. "Do you accept the standing of the seat of the returned, with full understanding of what acceptance activates?" "Yes," Harry said again. Seraphine unrolled the scroll and held it between them. "Then seal it with your blood, as Isadora sealed it with hers." Ragnarok had given him back the silver pin from the heritage test. Harry had kept it for reasons he hadn't fully articulated to himself, and now he understood why. He'd known, in the way you know things without examining them, that it wasn't finished with yet. He pressed the pin to his thumb, pressed his thumb to the bottom of the scroll where the seal was. The blood hit the ancient parchment. And then it was not small anymore. The light didn't change, not the way lightning changes light, not with a flash. It was more like a lens shifting into focus. The evening around them became sharply, almost painfully clear, every detail present in the way that things are present in the moment before sleep when the mind releases its filters. The roses on the estate walls, the particular quality of the Bordeaux Valley going gold below them, the faces of the Veela court, all of it present and specific and weighted, real in a way that was different from the ordinary realness of things. Harry felt it run through him from the point of contact outward, not painful, not dramatic, more like something clicking into alignment, a key finding its lock as he'd thought of it this morning on the terrace. The sensation was warm and deep and had an old quality to it, old in the way of rivers and mountains, old in the way of things that have been waiting patiently for the right moment because they understood that time was not the same as delay. He heard, or felt, the line between the two was unclear, something like music. Not a melody. More like a fundamental note, very low, below the range of ordinary hearing, the note that very large bells make when they're struck and the sound goes down rather than up. And then, from that note, other notes, resonances, harmonics, each distinct, each real, each connected to something. 27 connections, warm and present, drawing taut like strings brought to their proper tension. And then, the others. Not 27. More. Many more. The network Seraphine had described, the full web of Veela blood bonds stretching across Britain and beyond, dormant and forgotten and ignored and stolen and corrupted, all of them now suddenly, quietly, undeniably awake. Not loud. Not overwhelming. Just, present. Each one a thread, a thin line of connection between the world as it was and the world as it was supposed to be, vibrating with the low fundamental note that was still running through Harry and through the parchment and through the seal that Isadora had made 400 years ago and trusted would hold. He looked up. The Veela court was very still. Seraphine's eyes were closed. Her face had an expression Harry had never seen on her, not the composed authority of the Queen or the careful warmth of his advocate. Something underneath all of that. Something that was, very quietly, astonished. When she opened her eyes and looked at him, they were the brightest he'd ever seen them, the amber lit from behind. Isadora, she said, very softly, more to herself than to him, was not exaggerating. Harry looked at his hands. They looked exactly the same. He felt exactly the same, or almost. There was the new quality of the threads he could sense, the low note still resonating somewhere in his core, but nothing dramatic. Nothing that announced itself. He looked at Fleur. She was staring at him with an expression that was, for once, entirely open, not the controlled directness she usually wore, not the almost smile, just her face responding to something it hadn't expected and hadn't had time to arrange itself around. She looked, briefly, like someone much younger, like someone who is seeing something remarkable for the first time and hasn't remembered yet to be self-possessed about it. "Harry," she said. Just his name. "I'm fine," he said. Then, because she'd told him weeks ago that he didn't have to say that for other people's benefit, actually fine. "I just feel," he tried to find the word. "Correct. Correct," she repeated. "Like something was at the wrong angle before and it isn't anymore." Gabrielle said nothing. She walked forward through the ring of Veela court members with the absolute confidence of a 7-year-old who has decided something and is acting on it, came to stand in front of Harry, and looked up at him with her enormous blue eyes. Then she put one small hand over her own heart and said, in French, something short and serious. She says, Fleur translated, very quietly, from across the ring, that she can feel it. The note. She says it sounds like home. Harry looked at Gabrielle. This 7-year-old who had claimed him as her best friend from a distance of 30 feet, who had sat through legal proceedings with the patience of someone doing important work, who heard the activation of a 400-year-old seal as something that sounded like home. He thought about the Dursleys. He thought about Vernon's television and Petunia's sharp economic steps and the cupboard under the stairs. He thought about a terrace in the Bordeaux hills and morning light and tea in an old earthenware pot. He put his hand over Gabrielle's hand, brief and gentle. She nodded, very seriously, as if they had reached an agreement. They had. They left for Britain the next morning. It was still early when Ragnar's Gringotts delegation met them at the Portkey Point, Goldvault and 2 others, carrying the document cases, and Ragnar himself, who looked at Harry when he arrived with an expression that was doing a lot more than the director usually let it do. You look different, Ragnar said. Do I? Harry looked at himself. He still looked the same as far as he could tell. Not in appearance, Ragnar said. In posture. A pause. Your magical signature is different. It has depth it didn't have before. The kind of depth that heritage scans identify as. He stopped. Then, with the precision of a goblin who does not use imprecise language by accident, fully established. Fully present. He looked at Seraphine. The activation. Yes, Seraphine said. Ragnar was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded, the decisive goblin nod of someone updating an assessment significantly. Good, he said. Because we have a complicated few days ahead of us. The situation with Sirius Black was handled with the specific care of something that was legally sensitive, emotionally enormous, and practically urgent all at once. Amelia Bones had released him 2 days prior with a provisional order that carried the formal weight of the DMLE's acknowledgement that the original imprisonment was procedurally invalid. He was currently in a ministry medical facility, under care, while his case was formally reviewed. Harry asked to see him that afternoon. Ragnar made a call. By 2 o'clock, Harry was in a pale, clean room in the ministry's medical wing, and Sirius Black was sitting in the bed, and it was one of the more complicated moments Harry had experienced, which was saying something given his recent weeks. He'd expected, he didn't know what he'd expected. Something more visibly broken, perhaps, 7 years of Dementors leaving more obvious marks. The man in the bed was thin, noticeably, and the hollowness around his eyes was the kind that didn't come from a single bad night but from sustained darkness, accumulated and deep. His hair was long and unkempt and his hands, resting on the blanket, had the slight tremble of someone whose body had been running on not enough for too long. But his eyes were gray and clear and entirely present, and when Harry walked in, those eyes fixed on him with the kind of attention that didn't perform itself, just existed, focused and immediate. Harry, Sirius said. His voice was rough from disuse, but the roughness was in the instrument, not in what it was expressing. What it was expressing was something vast and uncomplicated and entirely undisguised. Hi, Harry said. He sat down in the chair beside the bed because standing felt like being farther away than he wanted to be. Sirius looked at him for a long moment. You look like James, he said. Same hair. Same, he stopped. You have Lily's eyes, though. She had extraordinary eyes. People say that, Harry said. It's true. A pause. I heard what you've been doing. Ragnar sent word. Something moved through Sirius's face, complicated, carrying the weight of years. 27 seats. The Wisengamot session. Malfoy. The vault break-in, Harry said. Ragnar says they caught the person. Do you know what's in the primary vault that Malfoy wants? Sirius blinked. Then, and this was something Harry hadn't expected, he laughed. Short and genuine, surprised out of him, and the laugh cracked something in the hollowness of his face and let something younger and more real show through. James told me, he said. He kept copies. Of everything. Your father was methodical, in ways people didn't always expect from him. He kept original copies of every property document, every seat registration, every family contract going back 3 generations. In the vault. He looked at Harry steadily. He told me once that the copies were an insurance policy. That if anyone ever tried to take what was the family's, the vault would be the proof. He knew it was a risk, Harry said. He grew up watching it happen, Sirius said, and something in his voice went darker, quieter. His father's generation. The quiet stripping of old family seats during the war years. He talked about it. About how systematic it was, how it moved through the registry like a slow flood. His jaw set. He kept copies because he understood that the people doing it were counting on everyone else's records being the only records. Malfoy needs to get to those copies before the adjudication, Harry said. If the originals are in the vault, they prove the forgeries conclusively. No procedural challenge survives that. Then make sure Ragnarok has those copies in hand before the session, Sirius said. He was leaning forward slightly now, the blanket forgotten, the medical wing stillness replaced with something more alive. Pull everything from the primary vault and have it in the formal documentary record before the session opens. If the originals are already submitted as evidence, breaking into the vault after becomes irrelevant. Harry looked at him. You're good at this. I grew up in the family that wrote the book on this kind of political maneuvering, Sirius said, with a bitterness that was old and specific. The difference being that the blacks used those skills for entirely different purposes. A pause. I spent a lot of years in Azkaban thinking about all the ways I should have fought harder before it got to the point where fighting at all seemed necessary. He met Harry's eyes. I'm glad you're fighting. I had good information, Harry said. You had the same information I had, at 12 years old, Sirius said. I didn't do anything like this with it. He paused, and what was in his face then was complicated and real and carrying the specific weight of a person who has examined their own choices from inside 7 years of consequence. You're better at this than I was. I had good help, Harry said. Don't undersell yourself, Sirius said, and his voice was firm in the way of someone who has specific opinions about this. I've heard how you handled Malfoy in the Gringotts meeting. I've heard what you did in the Wisengamot session. That's not help. That's you. He looked at Harry for a long moment, the grey eyes clear and direct and doing the complicated thing that was too big for the room but belonged there anyway. Your parents would, he stopped. The hollowness came back briefly, then receded. Yeah, Harry said quietly. I know. They sat in the pale room for a while, not trying to compress 7 years and 8 years and the whole shape of a life that should have been different into the time available. Just, present with each other, in the strange and specific way of two people who are strangers because a third party made choices that made them strangers, and who are not, given the chance to sit in the same room, strangers at all. Outside, through the window, London went about its business, entirely unaware. When you're well enough, Harry said eventually. Will you, I mean. The will says, the moment I'm medically cleared, Sirius said, with a directness that left no room for anything, there is nowhere else I am going. Harry nodded. He felt the threads again, the network of them running quiet and deep below everything, all the connections made and unmade and waiting to be remade properly. The low note from the seal, still resonating. The world at the wrong angle, correcting itself. Not all at once. Not easily. Not without Lucius Malfoy and all the others who'd built their positions on what had been stolen doing everything in their considerable power to prevent it. But correcting. He took the bus back to the leaky cauldron. He had Ragnarok to meet, vault contents to retrieve, an adjudication case to finish building, and somewhere in the sequence of all of it, a drawer to open when there was finally enough space. The evening was warm and the streets were full, and he walked through them, hands in the pockets of clothes that fit, and felt the threads, all of them, and let them remind him what the work was for. Chapter 6, the 31st seat. The adjudication session was set for a Thursday in September, and London decided to mark the occasion with the kind of autumn morning that made every other kind of morning seem like it was trying too hard, cool and clear and carrying the particular quality of light that belongs to early September, when the summer has just released its grip and everything is briefly, perfectly itself. Harry arrived at the ministry at 8:30, 2 hours before the session. Ragnarok had been there since 6. Harry knew this because when he walked into the stone-walled room that had become, over the past weeks, something close to familiar, the table was covered in the organized precision of someone who had not gone home the night before. Gold Vault and Iron Scribe were already working, their document cases open, cross-referencing the vault contents against the submission record with the focused, bilateral efficiency of two people who have done this before and have opinions about getting it right. The vault contents were extraordinary. Harry had been in the primary Potter vault 3 days ago, with Ragnarok beside him and 2 security goblins at the door, and what he'd found was what Sirius had described, the methodical, deliberate archive of a man who understood that records were weapons if you kept them and vulnerabilities if you didn't. 3 generations of property documents, original copies, each one in a sealed magical preservation case that had kept them in the exact condition they'd been in when James Potter had placed them there. Marriage records, blood adoption registrations, seat transfer documents, and beside each one, in some cases, a handwritten note in James's sprawling writing. Brief annotations, the notes of someone who had looked at these documents with the specific wariness of a person who expected them to matter eventually. Beside the first of the Malfoy seat documents, the 1971 blood adoption, James had written 3 words, "This one is wrong." The comparison was definitive. The authentication signature on the fraudulent Wisengamot registry version did not match the authentication signature on the original, which was not a forgery because it was the original, the real document from the real official, showing a legitimate family transaction from a legitimate year, completely different in content from what had been filed in the registry. Someone had taken a genuine document, studied its authentication marks, fabricated a version with different content but matching authentication, and substituted it in the Wisengamot records. The original had been sitting in the Potter vault for 50 years, waiting. James Potter had known. He'd written "This one is wrong" in his own handwriting and put the proof in a vault that a forged blood authentication key had been crafted to break into 2 weeks before the adjudication session. Ragnarok had added the vault contents to the documentary record the same day they were retrieved. Whatever Malfoy had hoped to achieve with the vault break-in had been made irrelevant before the DMLE had finished processing the would-be thief, a low-level records clerk from the Wisengamot registry office with 3 payments from the Malfoy family vault logged in the Gringotts transaction record over the past 6 months. Harry had looked at that transaction record and thought, of course. Of course Malfoy had prepared for this. Of course there was a clerk. Of course there were payments. The architecture of it was consistent, systematic, layered, always operating inside the systems meant to catch it, turning those systems' own precision against them. The difference, this time, was that Gringotts was on the other side. "The session will open at 10:30, Ragnarok said, when Harry sat down. He was reviewing a document and didn't look up, which Harry had learned was Ragnarok's version of comfortable familiarity. "The full chamber will be present. Word has spread." He turned a page. "The gallery will be full." "The families under investigation?" Harry asked. "All present and required to be." Madame Longbottom issued a formal attendance summons for every holder of a contested seat. Ragnarok looked up. "Malfoy arrived at the ministry 45 minutes ago. He brought 3 solicitors." Harry thought about Malfoy and his 3 solicitors and the 2 weeks since the preliminary session during which Malfoy had been recalculating. He'd filed the emergency injunction against the custodial petition, dismissed, quietly, by a Wisengamot records officer who apparently had the backbone to apply the law even when the person challenging it had 3 solicitors. He'd made 2 formal requests for postponement of the adjudication, both denied by Longbottom, each denial issued with the crisp efficiency of someone who had seen delay tactics before and considered them beneath the dignity of the proceedings. He'd arranged for 4 members of the chamber who held seats adjacent to the contested ones, not on the fraudulent list themselves but politically aligned with those who were, to file supporting arguments on procedural grounds. Ragnarok had spent the past week addressing each one with the quiet, methodical thoroughness of someone who had been looking forward to this and intended to do it properly. "Is there anything he hasn't tried?" Harry asked. Ragnarok considered this with genuine thought. "He has not attempted a direct public appeal to the Muggle concept of double jeopardy," he said. "But the Wisengamot has no such rule, so that would have been futile. Otherwise, he has been comprehensive." "How is he this morning?" "When he came in?" Ragnarok set down his document. "He was composed," he said. "Entirely composed. Spoke pleasantly to the security staff. Stopped to talk with 2 members of the chamber in the entrance hall. Appeared to be in good spirits." He paused. "Which is either genuine confidence or the performance of it." "There's something we don't know," Harry said. "There is always something one doesn't know," Ragnarok said. "The question is whether the unknown thing is critical." "Yes," Harry said. "That is the question." He spent the next hour in the review of the presentation structure, the order of evidence, the testimony sequence, the moment at which the vault documents would be formally introduced and cross-referenced against the registry versions. He knew it all already. He'd been over it enough times that the architecture of it was solid in his mind, the whole sequence visible at once like a map he'd memorized. He went over it again not because he needed to but because he found that the review itself was useful. Each pass clarified the shape of it, identified which parts were load-bearing and which were reinforcing, which transitions were smooth and which might catch on something unexpected. At 9:15, Seraphine arrived. She was in full court dress, robes of deep gold and cream, the same colors her companions wore but with a different quality, the way a conductor looks different from the orchestra not because of what they're wearing but because of how they're wearing it. The court token, the silver crest of the Veela Queen, was visible at her collar. Her hair was in the formal arrangement of the Queen's court presentation, and she walked into the room with the quality that Harry had come to understand was not performance, it was precision. She was exactly what she needed to be in exactly this moment, and the exactness was its own form of power. Fleur was behind her, in robes that matched the court colors but with her own quality to them, the sharpness she always carried, today contained and directed. She looked at Harry when she came in and the look said clearly, without words, "How are you?" in the specific way she asked things, which was direct enough to require a direct answer. He held up 2 fingers. "Fine. Genuinely." She gave a small nod. "Good enough." Gabrielle, who had been told in terms more explicit than Harry had thought necessary that the gallery would be supervised and that she was to stay in the gallery at all times, had apparently agreed to all of these terms while simultaneously planning her own version of events. She appeared at Harry's shoulder approximately 3 minutes after Seraphine arrived, having apparently located and exploited a passage between the gallery preparation area and the floor-level anteroom, and she was entirely unrepentant about it. "I wanted to see you before," she said, with the simplicity of someone for whom wanting to do something and doing it occupied consecutive rather than separate moments. "Gabrielle," Fleur started. "I will go back before the session opens," Gabrielle said. She looked at Harry with the directness that was her version of ceremony. "You will be good today." "I'll try," Harry said. "Non," Gabrielle said firmly. "You will be good. You do not have to try. It is just what you are." She gave him the considering look of someone who has reached a conclusion through careful observation and is stating it as fact. "I have been watching you for 6 weeks. I know." Harry looked at this 7-year-old who had sat through more legal proceedings than most adults and had apparently been conducting her own independent assessment throughout, and he thought that when Gabrielle Delacour was 15 she was going to be absolutely extraordinary and the world was not prepared for it. "Thank you," he said. She nodded, satisfied, and went back toward the gallery passage. "She will be extraordinary and terrible when she is older," Fleur said, watching her go. "I know," Harry said. Fleur looked at him. "Ready?" "Yes," he said. It was the truest thing he'd said all morning. Sirius Black arrived at 9:45. He was still thin. That wasn't something 6 weeks of ministry medical care fully corrected, but the medical facility had done what it could, and what it could do was, it turned out, considerable. He was dressed in robes that were clean and fitted, his hair pulled back, and he moved through the anteroom with the contained energy of someone who has been running at minimum power for a very long time and is now, cautiously but definitely, running at something more. He stopped when he saw Harry, and his expression did the thing it had done in the medical facility, the vast, uncomplicated thing, but today there was something added to it that hadn't been there before. He looked at Harry and then at Seraphine, at Ragnarok's table of documents, at the organized readiness of the whole room, and what was in his face was something Harry thought might be what it looked like when a person who has been living with a specific grief discovers that the grief has a future tense. "DMLE cleared me for public appearances yesterday," he said. His voice was stronger than it had been 6 weeks ago. "Amelia Bones wanted to observe the session herself, but she has a conflict. She sent her deputy." A pause. "The formal trial is scheduled for next week. Procedurally, it's a formality at this point. The investigative report is conclusive." "Good," Harry said. Sirius looked at him for a moment. Something was visibly working behind his eyes, something he wanted to say that was large enough that he was finding the approach to it. Then he settled on, "Your mother would have found all of this infuriating and brilliant in equal parts. Your father would have been insufferable about it." His jaw did something complicated. "I mean that as the highest possible compliment." "I know," Harry said. Seraphine placed a hand briefly on Sirius's arm as he passed her, brief, deliberate, the greeting of one person to another who has been somewhere they shouldn't have had to go. Sirius looked at her, and what passed between them was the acknowledgement of something that didn't need to be spoken. At 10:20, they moved to the chamber. The difference from the preliminary session was immediate and atmospheric. The gallery was not just full, it was packed, standing room only in the upper tiers, the quality of attention in the room heightened and specific. The chamber floor had more occupants, not just the seat holders under investigation but additional Wisengamot members who had been present at the preliminary session and had come back, Harry suspected, because they understood that today was the kind of day that got recorded. The implicated families were visible in their benches. The Malfoy bench, Lucius, immaculate and composed, his 3 solicitors arranged behind him with the precision of a prepared position. Knott, Parkinson, Burke, the other significant holders, each present, each carrying the specific quality of people who have had 6 weeks to look at the evidence against them and understand what looking at it means. The Greengrass bench was different. Cyrus Greengrass, who had filed the negotiated resolution counterclaim 6 weeks ago, was sitting with the expression of someone who had already separated himself from the others and was here today to demonstrate that separation. Harry noticed this and filed it. He walked to the floor-level bench, took his seat, and looked at the chamber. The chamber looked back. It was a different quality of looking than 6 weeks ago. Then they'd been looking at a child with a claim. Now they were looking at someone who had, in the intervening 6 weeks, filed vault evidence that demolished 2 separate forgery defenses, triggered the release of an unjustly imprisoned man, facilitated an active DMLE investigation, and arrived this morning with Ragnarok's full documentary record behind him and the Veela Queen beside him. Still 8 years old. Still wearing clothes that fit. The ratio of those 2 things had shifted. Longbottom opened the session at 10:30 with the efficiency Harry had come to expect of her, and the opening procedures moved through their stages with the precision of something that has been practiced enough to flow. The documentation was formally entered into record, All of it, the investigation findings and the vault originals and the transaction records and the analysis of the vault break-in attempt and the registry clerk's payments. All of it, in the formal record, read into the chamber with Ragnar's flat, precise voice, each element building on the last, the whole structure making itself visible in the chamber the way the family tree had made itself visible on the heritage test parchment, lines connecting, patterns emerging, the shape of a 50-year campaign rendered undeniable by the accumulation of specific, documented, cross-referenced fact. The chamber was very quiet. Malfoy's 3 solicitors had been busy. The first rose to present their defense and it was, Harry gave them credit, sophisticated, a layered challenge that attacked the chain of custody on 2 of the vault documents, questioned the admissibility of Gringotts' transaction records as evidence in a governance proceeding, and raised a jurisdictional argument about the Veela sovereignty seat that was technically different enough from the previous jurisdictional argument to require Ragnar to address it separately rather than simply citing his previous response. Ragnar addressed it separately. It took 6 minutes and the solicitor sat down looking like someone who had brought an umbrella to a situation that turned out to require something more substantial. The second solicitor rose and went after the methodology of the heritage test itself, the accuracy of blood sense detection, the reliability of the Veela Queen's identification of Harry in Diagon Alley, the possibility that the entire proceeding rested on a perceptual error. Seraphine stood. She did not approach the floor. She simply stood at her seat, in the gold court dress, the silver crest at her collar, and she looked at the solicitor with the amber eyes that missed nothing and said, in a voice that carried to the highest gallery with no visible effort, "I am the reigning Veela Queen. I have blood sense capability that has been tested and documented by 3 independent magical authorities including the International Confederation of Wizards. In 40 years of practice, my blood sense has never produced a false positive. The suggestion that it might have done so in this case is a solicitor's argument, not a factual claim. I am happy to submit to any additional verification this chamber requires." The solicitor said that would not be necessary. The third solicitor rose for what Harry had identified from the beginning as the real argument, the one Malfoy had been holding back, the one that the first 2 were covering for, the one that was designed to survive the failure of the others. The matter of intent, the solicitor said. He was older than the other 2, more measured, with the quality of someone who has saved himself for the closing argument. The documentary evidence presented by Gringotts demonstrates, we accept, irregularities in the registration of these seats. We do not contest the heritage test results. What we contest is the characterization of these irregularities as intentional fraud, as opposed to administrative errors that accumulated over decades of post-war confusion. He looked at the chamber. Lucius Malfoy was 17 years old when the first of these seats was registered to his family. He inherited them at the age of 23. He has administered them in good faith on the basis of registrations he received, not registrations he created. He paused, letting the reasonable sound of it fill the chamber. The question before this chamber is not whether the seats ultimately belong to Harry Potter. Gringotts' evidence on that point is, we acknowledge, compelling. The question is whether the current holders should be held criminally liable for registrations whose origins they did not create and whose fraudulent basis they had no means to independently verify. He let this settle. We submit that a fair resolution, one consistent with the values of this chamber and the principles of magical justice, would order the return of the seats without criminal sanction for the current holders, recognizing that the true perpetrators of any original fraud are, in the cases of most of these registrations, no longer living. Harry looked at the chamber. He watched the effect of the argument moving through it, the slight shift in posture, the expressions recalibrating. It was a good argument. He'd known it was coming. He'd spent time with it, working through it from the inside, because the best way to understand what an argument would do in a room was to give it its strongest possible form before you met it. He stood up. Longbottom looked at him. "Mr. Potter." "Thank you," he said to her, then looked at the chamber. "The third solicitor's argument is the most compelling one presented today, and I want to acknowledge that, because it deserves to be answered properly." He paused. The argument is that intent can't be proven for the current holders, and therefore sanction is unjust. That's a reasonable principle in isolation. He reached into his jacket and produced a document, single page, Gringotts certified, the transaction record he'd been holding until this moment. Except for this. 6 months ago, 2 months before the heritage test, before any investigation was filed or any injunction sought, Lucius Malfoy's family vault made a payment of 400 galleons to the Wizengamot registry clerk who was arrested attempting to break into the Potter primary vault. He held it up. Not after the investigation started. Before it. Before anyone outside this room and a small number of goblins knew that the heritage test had happened or that an investigation was coming. He let the chamber be quiet for a moment. The only explanation for paying a registry clerk before there's an investigation is that you already knew something might need to be removed from the registry, Harry said. Malfoy didn't make that payment because he had good faith in the legitimacy of his holdings. He made it because he knew, and he was preparing. He looked at Malfoy directly. The intent argument was well constructed. But intent requires pre-knowledge, and the transaction record is the pre-knowledge. They're in the same document. The silence that followed was a different quality from all the previous silences. This one had finality in it. The kind of quiet that a room produces when it has arrived somewhere and understands that it has arrived and there is no path back from the arrival. Lucius Malfoy was looking at Harry across the chamber floor, and he was not composed. Not outwardly broken, he was too disciplined for that, but the composure had finally, after 6 weeks and multiple sessions and the accumulated weight of documented evidence rendered undeniable, reached its limit. What was underneath it was not anger, Harry thought. It was the specific expression of a man who had run an extraordinarily sophisticated operation for decades and is watching it dismantle itself, piece by piece, not because of a more powerful opponent but because someone kept very good records and the records had found their person. Ragnarok stood. The transaction document was submitted to the formal record at 8:47 this morning, he said. It was the final piece of the documentary submission. It has been in the record throughout this session. He sat back down. Longbottom called for responses. 3 members of the chamber spoke, 2 in support of full sanction, 1 requesting a measured approach to the criminal liability question. Then Amelia Bones' deputy stood and read a prepared statement from the DMLE declaring that in their assessment, the transaction record constituted sufficient evidence of intent to pursue criminal fraud charges against Lucius Malfoy and, pending further investigation, potentially others among the current holders. The vote was called. On the question of return of all 27 seats to Harry James Potter, 71 in favor, 12 against, 4 abstentions. On the question of referring the matter of criminal fraud charges to the DMLE for formal prosecution, 68 in favor, 14 against, 7 abstentions. On the question of a formal investigation into the role of the Wizengamot Registry Office in facilitating fraudulent seat registrations, Longbottom's own edition, tabled as a supplementary motion, unanimous. The chamber had moved. The sound that went through it was not celebration, this wasn't that kind of room, but it was significant, a collective release of held breath, the sound of a body that has been asked to do a hard thing and has done it. Harry sat with it for a moment. 27 seats. Returned. The papers would be processed over the coming weeks, the registry corrected, the Wizengamot rolls amended. It would take time and documentation and the thoroughness that Gringotts brought to everything it did. But the decision was made. The vote was in the record. He looked at the Malfoy bench. Lucius was speaking to his solicitors in a very low voice, his back to the chamber, and whatever he was saying to them had the quality of a man organizing for the next phase of something rather than accepting the conclusion of the current one. He had criminal charges coming. He had solicitors and resources and the formidable intelligence that Harry had, over these weeks, come to genuinely respect in the way you respect something that has forced you to be better than you would have been without it. This was not over for Malfoy. He would fight the criminal charges. He would use every tool available. He might succeed in some of that, Harry wasn't naive about the relationship between wealth and legal outcomes. But the seats were gone. The fraudulent registrations were in the formal record. The transaction document was evidence. The shape of what he'd built was visible now, permanently, in the documented history of the Wizengamot. That was its own kind of completion. Longbottom adjourned the formal session and the chamber began its organized dispersal. Harry stood and turned to find Seraphine watching him, and beside her Fleur, and just beyond them Sirius, who looked like someone who had been holding his breath for 6 weeks and had now, carefully, let it out. Harry walked over to them, and Sirius reached out and gripped his shoulder with the firmness of someone who has been wanting to do something solid and real and is finally in the position to do it. "Your father," Sirius said, and had to stop. He tried again. "James kept those copies. For 30 years. He stopped again. Then, quietly, with the precision of someone choosing the exact right word, "Proud doesn't cover it." "I know," Harry said, for the 3rd time, and this time it was true in a different register, not the automatic comfort of the word but the actual knowledge of it, the felt knowledge, the kind that lives somewhere below language and has always been there. The chamber was emptying. Around them, members moved toward exits in the clusters and conversations of people processing something large. Cyrus Greengrass paused on his way out and looked at Harry with the expression of someone who has made a decision about which side of something they're on and wants that decision acknowledged. "Potter," he said. "My family's solicitors will be in touch with Gringotts regarding the seat return. We intend to make it uncomplicated." He paused. "I was not aware of the full circumstances of the original transfer. I want you to know that." "I know," Harry said. He thought about Ragnarok's assessment 6 weeks ago, not fully voluntary. The Greengrass family's female member, the marriage contract, the coercion clause buried in archaic language. Your family was a victim of the same people. Greengrass looked at him for a moment. Something in his face settled. "Yes," he said. "Thank you." He walked on. The chamber was nearly empty when Harry became aware of it, the low note, the resonance, the thing that had settled into him in the Bordeaux garden and had been running quietly underneath everything since. It was different now. Not louder, but, changed in quality, the way a sound changes when the room it's in changes. Cleaner. More resolved. He had assumed the activation of the seat would mean something visible. Something dramatic. The diagrams in Isadora's scroll, the circles within circles, the radiating lines, he'd imagined something that would announce itself, that would make itself known to the chamber or to Malfoy or to the network of stolen bonds in some form he could observe and report on. Instead it had been quiet. It had been 6 weeks of evidence reviewed and motions filed and sessions attended and a boy from a cupboard under the stairs standing in the most powerful room in British magical governance and saying this is what is true with enough precision and enough documentation and enough straightforward refusal to be smaller than he was that the room had voted. He thought about Isadora's description, the one who would arrive and do the work. Not a hero. A mechanism. Someone through whom the accumulated wrong would be processed and discharged. He thought about the network of bonds, all the dormant ones, all the forgotten ones, the ones still active and the ones long corrupted. He thought about the note in his core, the circles within circles, the activation. He thought about whether this was the activation, not a flash of light but this, exactly this, a room full of people who had the choice to protect what had been stolen or to acknowledge what was real, and who had chosen, by 68 votes to 14, to acknowledge what was real. Maybe that was what old magic looked like when it worked. Not spectacle. Just the patient correction of things, one documented truth at a time. Ragnarok was at his elbow, documents under one arm, expression doing the thing adjacent to satisfaction that Harry had learned to read as the goblin's version of genuine pleasure. Full adjudication complete, Ragnarok said. Gringotts will process the seat transfers over the next 4 weeks. Registry corrections will be filed simultaneously. He paused. The criminal referral for Malfoy will be with the DMLE by end of day. And Sirius? His formal trial is Tuesday. It is, as he said, procedurally a formality. Innocence on all charges is the only defensible verdict. I will testify in person. He paused, and what was in his face for just a moment was something that went back to the medical wing, to a man in a bed with hollow eyes and a rough voice. He should have had this 7 years ago. Yes, Harry said. He should have. Ragnarok looked at him for a beat. You realize, he said, and his tone was different from the times he'd said something similar before, quieter, more private, that the 27 seats are the surface. The transaction record you produced today, combined with the registry investigation Longbottom tabled, will open a review of Wisengamot registration practices going back decades. The DMLE investigation of Malfoy will, if it's conducted properly by Bones' office, follow the threads into every piece of this, the solicitors, the payment networks, the constructed precedents in smaller cases that were used as stepping stones to the larger ones. He paused. What you've started today will take years to complete. There are people in this building right now who don't know yet that they're part of it. I know, Harry said. You are 8 years old. I know that too. He looked at the empty chamber, the plum-cushioned benches, the carved stone, the galleries where the light was different now that the people had cleared from them. He thought about what Ragnarok had said, the years of work still ahead, the depth of what had been built inside these systems and how long it would take to trace all of it. He thought about Isadora's mechanism and the circles within circles and the bonds, all of them, the whole web of them still quietly alive and waiting. But I'm going to keep being 8 years old for a while, he said. And then 9. And the years will pass the same for me as for anyone else. He looked at Ragnarok. There's time. Ragnarok looked at him for a long moment with the old, sharp, flint-chip eyes. Then he did something Harry had not seen him do once in 3 months of working alongside him. He smiled. Small, brief, entirely real. Yes, he said. There is. Outside the chamber, the anteroom was full of conversation and movement and the organized aftermath of a significant session. Seraphine was speaking with 2 members of the chamber who had approached her, the political business of the Veela court, the treaty implications, the formal acknowledgement of the sovereignty seat's return. She handled it with the ease of someone who has been navigating these waters for decades and finds them neither threatening nor exhausting, just the work of what she is. Fleur found Harry beside the window of the anteroom, looking out over the ministry's internal atrium, the fountain at its center, the figures that had been replaced after the war with something less oppressive but still not quite right, the witches and wizards moving through the space below with the daily purposefulness of a world getting on with itself. How does it feel? She asked. He thought about it. He was honest with Fleur in a way he was learning to be honest with himself, not performing the functional answer, actually checking what was true. Large, he said. And unfinished. And, he paused. Good. It feels good. Not triumphant. Just, the right things are in motion. That is, Fleur said, an extraordinarily mature answer for someone your age. Is it? Most people, if they'd done what you've just done, would feel triumphant, she said. You feel responsible. She was looking at him with the direct, unsentimental focus that was her version of warmth, and today it had something else in it too, something that had been building over 6 weeks and was now, in the aftermath of the session, present without the careful containing she usually gave it. That is not a common quality. You said that before, Harry said. In the bank. After the preliminary session. I say things more than once when they continue to be true, Fleur said. Harry looked at her. France, he said. After Sirius's trial. When things are a bit more settled. You said there would be room. Something moved in her face. The almost smile, closer than it had ever gotten. There will always be room, she said, and the certainty of it was its own kind of warmth. Seraphine found him 10 minutes later, the political business concluded, and walked with him to the atrium where Sirius was waiting, sitting on a bench with the stillness of someone who is tired in the good way, the way of having done something that needed to be done. He looked up when they approached. "Longbottom spoke to me on her way out," Sirius said. He looked at Harry. "She asked me to tell you," she said, "tell the boy he conducted himself with more sense than most adults I've seen in that chamber, and that if he ever wants advice on Wisengamot procedure from someone who's been watching it for 40 years, my door is open." "That's," Harry started. "High praise from Augusta Longbottom," Sirius said, with something in his voice that was warm and familiar and reminded Harry of how he'd felt on the terrace in Bordeaux, the recognition of a place that fit. "She doesn't give it often. Or lightly." Harry thought about Longbottom, her brisk efficiency, her refusal to let procedural challenges slow the session, the supplementary motion she'd tabled at the end, the decisive nod she'd given him 6 weeks ago. He thought about the door she'd opened. "When things settle down," he said, "I'd like to take her up on that." "Good instinct," Sirius said. He stood, and the standing was easier than it had been 6 weeks ago, the body remembering what it was for. He looked at Harry with those grey eyes that were, Harry had learned, entirely incapable of performing what they weren't feeling. They were feeling something large and quiet and, around the edges of the quiet, something that was beginning to look like future tense. "Ragnarok says 4 weeks for the seat transfers to process." "Yes. And you're," Sirius stopped. "Where are you?" He stopped again, and the thing he was trying to ask was visible under the surface of the attempts, the specific care of a person who doesn't want to presume something important. "The custodial arrangement with Seraphine is temporary," Harry said, giving it to him directly because making him ask for it was unkind. "It was a legal mechanism for the duration of the proceedings. After your trial," he paused, and the pause was not uncertainty. It was the moment before saying something true that has been true for a while. "After your trial, if you're ready, I think we should." "Yes," Sirius said, before Harry could finish finding the words for it. Quiet, immediate, entirely certain. "Yes." They stood in the ministry atrium in the aftermath of the session that had done what it needed to do, and the afternoon light came through the ceiling windows the way light comes through old glass, slightly uneven, full of character, making everything it landed on more itself. Harry felt the threads. All of them. The 27, now moving toward their proper alignment. The network beyond them, the dormant bonds and the forgotten ones, still humming with the low note that was Isadora's seal, still patient, still waiting, not urgently, but with the particular quality of things that understand that the work has begun and will continue. He felt the new ones too. Not old bonds, not ancient magic, just the present tense ones, the ones that didn't require a seal to be real. Ragnarok, with his flint chip eyes and his records and his specific, unglamorous integrity. Seraphine, the amber eyes and the tea in the earthenware pot and the trust of someone who had been looking for what he was for a very long time. Fleur, the directness and the almost smiles and the room that would always have space. Gabrielle, who had known from 30 feet in Diagon Alley and had seen no reason to pretend otherwise. Sirius, standing next to him in the atrium, thin and upright and alive. He was 8 years old. He had 27 seats being returned to him and a 28th that had been waiting 4 centuries and an activation that had worked not with spectacle but with steadiness, with documentation, with the willingness to stand in rooms full of people with everything to lose and say, "This is what is true." He had, for the first time in his life, more of his own story than had been taken from him. And there was still the rest of it to live. He put his hands in the pockets of clothes that fit, and walked with Sirius out of the ministry into the September morning, the cool clear light that made everything briefly, perfectly itself, and the city going about its business around them, entirely unaware. Which was fine. They'd find out, eventually. Things that were true had a way of making themselves known. He had time.